Consider the fundamental reality of human mortality. Regardless of how many people surround your deathbed, regardless of how many hands hold yours in those final moments, the experience of dying is an entirely solitary phenomenon that no other consciousness can truly share or witness from within. When your brain begins its final shutdown, when your neurons fire their last electrical impulses, when your sense of self begins to dissolve into nothing, you are experiencing something that exists only within the prison of your own mind, a private dissolution that no one else can access or truly comprehend. Your loved ones may be present in the room, they may speak to you, they may weep, but they cannot accompany you into that darkness. They cannot experience what it feels like from the inside as your awareness fades away. This is the mechanism at work. Consciousness itself is fundamentally isolated, locked within the biological substrate of individual brains, and death represents the ultimate expression of this isolation. No amount of connection, no depth of love, no strength of relationship can bridge this final gap, because the boundary between one mind and another is absolute and impassable. What makes this truth particularly unsettling is how thoroughly we have constructed our entire emotional and social world in denial of it, how we speak of dying peacefully or dying happy as though the quality of our death depends on anything other than the biological process itself. We comfort ourselves with the notion that we will not die alone if surrounded by family, but this is a kind of beautiful fiction we tell ourselves, a mutual agreement to pretend that proximity equals presence at the moment of ultimate severance. We have normalized this denial so completely that to speak of death's fundamental solitude is considered morbid or depressing, yet the reality persists unchanged beneath all our constructed meaning and comforting narratives, waiting quiet. Every moment of your life, you experience the sensation of making choices, of standing at crossroads and deciding which path to take, of exercising agency over your own destiny, and believing that your decisions flow from some essential core of yourself that exists independent of causality. Yet neuroscience has increasingly revealed that this subjective experience of free will appears to be fundamentally illusory, a post hoc narrative your brain constructs after decisions have already been made at the neurological level. Brain imaging studies consistently show that measurable neural activity precedes conscious awareness of making a choice by several seconds, suggesting that your brain has already committed to a decision before you become consciously aware of having made one at all. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon seems to involve the prefrontal cortex generating predetermined patterns of activation based on prior experiences, genetic predispositions, emotional states, and environmental stimuli. Yet your conscious mind experiences this output as a freely willed decision in the moment. What emerges is a peculiar situation where your sense of authorship and control over your actions is largely an after-the-fact confabulation, a story your brain tells itself to maintain coherence and a sense of unified identity. Despite mounting evidence suggesting that human behavior follows causal chains extending back through your history, neurobiology, and circumstances, society continues to operate on the assumption of robust free will, holding people morally and legally accountable for choices that may have been neurologically inevitable. This contradiction persists because the subjective feeling of agency is so overwhelming, so immediate, so central to how we experience existence, that intellectual arguments about determinism feel hollow against the phenomenological reality of deliberation and choice. There exists a peculiar threshold in human development where the permission to be uncertain, to play without purpose, to exist without productivity, simply vanishes overnight, and most of us never even notice the exact moment it happened. One day you are a child whose only obligation is to be present, to explore, to ask endless questions without fear of judgment, and the next day, not gradually, but with a shocking abruptness that feels almost violent in retrospect, the world expects you to have figured out the fundamental trajectory of your life. The mechanism behind this sudden termination is deceptively simple. Society has constructed an arbitrary age boundary, typically around 18 years old, after which the safety net of childhood protection is legally revoked, and all the adults around you simultaneously shift their gaze away from your well-being and toward your utility. This transition is not earned through any particular readiness or competence on your part. It is merely an administrative crossing of a numerical threshold that holds no bearing on your actual psychological maturity or emotional preparedness. What makes this phenomenon particularly unsettling is that we have completely normalized the idea that a teenager who cannot yet fully regulate their own dopamine production should suddenly be capable of selecting a career path that will define the next 50 years of their existence. Securing their own housing, managing their own healthcare, and navigating complex systems of finance and responsibility without guidance. The psychological whiplash of this transition is rarely discussed, yet it persists as one of the most consequential moments in human experience, a cliff edge rather than a slope, where the innocence of permission to not know is abruptly replaced with the terror of expectation to already be complete. Every time you recall a memory, you are not retrieving a static file from the archive of your mind, but rather reconstructing it from scattered fragments, and in that reconstruction, the memory fundamentally changes. You remember an argument from years ago, but the words you hear in your head are not the words that were actually spoken. They are approximations filtered through your current emotional state, your present beliefs, and the narrative you have constructed about yourself and the other person involved. Neuroscientists have discovered that each time a memory is retrieved, it becomes temporarily unstable, vulnerable to alteration, and when it is stored again, it may contain new details that were never actually part of the original experience, or it may have lost details that genuinely occurred. This process, called reconsolidation, means that your most vivid memories, the ones you're most confident about, are often the ones that have been altered the most, having been retrieved and reconstructed countless times over the years. You remember your childhood home with perfect clarity, but if you were to visit it, you might find that the hallway was shorter than you remembered, the bedroom window faced a different direction, the kitchen was a different color entirely. Yet despite knowing this, despite the scientific evidence being clear and accessible, people continue to trust their memories with absolute conviction, continuing to build their entire sense of identity and personal history on foundations that are being silently reconstructed every single time they think about them. We have normalized this fundamental instability at the core of our consciousness, accepting it as simply how memory works while simultaneously relying on memory as the primary evidence for who we are, what we have experienced, and why we believe what we believe, creating a paradox where the very mechanism we depend on for continuity of self is actively weary. Consider the arc of most human friendships, those connections that feel permanent in the moment yet dissolve with the passage of time and circumstance. You meet someone in school, at work, or through mutual acquaintances, and a bond forms that feels unbreakable. You share secrets, make plans for the future, promise to always stay in touch, and genuinely believe that this person will remain a meaningful presence in your life indefinitely. Yet statistically and observationally, the vast majority of these friendships fade into nothing more than occasional social media interactions or polite greetings if you happen to cross paths years later. The friendship simply ends, not with dramatic conflict, but with the quiet erosion that comes from changing circumstances, evolving interests, and the natural human tendency toward inertia. This happens because friendships are fundamentally situational constructs, requiring proximity, shared circumstances, and ongoing effort to maintain their vibrancy. When those conditions change, when you move to a different city or shift jobs or enter a new life phase, the friendship loses its structural scaffolding. Additionally, humans possess limited relational bandwidth. You cannot maintain deep connections with hundreds of people simultaneously, so your brain unconsciously prioritizes newer relationships and people who are currently present in your immediate environment. Older friendships quietly slip down the priority list until they occupy that strange liminal space where you care about the person in theory but never actually contact them. We normalize this pattern despite its fundamental sadness by treating it as inevitable, by creating euphemistic phrases like growing apart or life happens, when really what is happening is that we have accepted a system where meaningful human connections are treated as disposable. There exists a peculiar phenomenon that unfolds across the decades of human life, one so gradual and so normalized that we rarely acknowledge its profound strangeness. The person who raised you, who knew your deepest vulnerabilities during your formative years, who held you when you were helpless and afraid, eventually becomes someone you barely recognize. You spend your childhood in a state of total dependence on their moods, their decisions, their emotional availability, but somewhere along the way, the relationship inverts entirely. You grow older and begin to see them not as the all-knowing authority figure they seem to be, but as fallible humans making it up as they go along, and this realization creates an invisible distance that neither of you quite knows how to bridge. The mechanism behind this transformation is rooted in how we compartmentalize knowledge and identity. Your parents exist in your mind primarily through the lens of their parental role, defined by what they provided or failed to provide during your developmental years. But as you mature, you begin to grasp that they possess an entire inner world, complete with anxieties, regrets, desires, and secrets, which they largely kept hidden from you. The person you thought you knew was only a partial performance, a necessary edit of their complete self. Simultaneously, you yourself become a stranger to them, as your own hidden thoughts, struggles, and evolution occur largely outside their sight. What once felt like profound connection, the bond of care and dependence, becomes colored by misunderstanding, by assumptions about who each other really is that may be years or decades out of date. We accept this gradual estrangement as inevitable, even natural, rarely questioning why the people who shaped our entire existence should become distant, careful conversationalists who skate across the surface of genuine understanding, yet it persists regardless, a quiet grief we've caught. Consider the peculiar phenomenon that occurs as we move through life, where the passage of time itself seems to move faster the older we become, and this acceleration correlates directly with the deterioration of our bodies and minds. A child experiences a single year as an eternity because it represents a large fraction of their total existence, while an adult moving through their fourth or fifth decade finds that years collapse into one another, seasons blur together, and entire periods vanish from memory as though they never truly occurred. This subjective acceleration is not merely a trick of perception or a romanticized notion, but rather a documented cognitive mechanism rooted in how our brains process novelty and familiarity. When we are young, everything is new. Every experience carries weight and distinction because we have so few reference points, so our neural systems encode these moments vividly and densely into memory, making each year feel substantial and lengthy. Yet as we age, we encounter fewer genuinely novel experiences, and our brains, having developed efficient processing patterns, move through repetitive days with less engagement and less detailed encoding, making time appear to vanish almost without our notice. The cruel mechanism at work here is that this acceleration of subjective time coincides precisely with the period when our bodies are declining most rapidly, when our cells are dividing less accurately, when our telomeres are shortening, and when the visible and invisible signs of aging become increasingly apparent. We lose hair, our skin thins, our bones weaken, our energy depletes, and yet the time in which this occurs passes so quickly that we barely notice ourselves transforming until we encounter an old photograph or glimpse an unexpected reflection. Consider the relationship that begins with overwhelming intensity, where two people feel they have discovered something rare and irreplaceable, where every moment together seems to shimmer with significance and every absence creates a profound ache of longing. The early stages of romantic love involve a neurochemical state that is measurable and real, a flooding of dopamine and norepinephrine that creates a sense of euphoria and obsessive focus on another person. But this state, by its very nature, cannot be sustained indefinitely because the human brain adapts to stimuli, becoming desensitized through repeated exposure, and the novelty that once triggered such intense reward pathways gradually fades into the familiar texture of daily existence. What begins as a fire that consumes all your attention transforms imperceptibly into a warm background presence, and then sometimes into something that barely registers at all. You stop noticing the small details that once seemed endlessly fascinating, the particular way your partner laughs or moves through space, because these things have become the unremarkable backdrop of your life rather than miracles worthy of constant wonder. The intensity of early love is actually a kind of temporary madness, a state of cognitive distortion where you overlook flaws and incompatibilities, where you misremember conversations in ways that favor your partner, where you interpret ambiguous actions in the most generous possible light. As this madness recedes and reality clarifies, you see your partner more accurately, which means you see their genuine limitations and their ordinary humanity, and this knowledge naturally diminishes the intensity of your attraction. We have constructed an entire cultural mythology around the idea that true love should feel like the beginning always feels, that if the intensity fades then something has gone wrong, that you have somehow failed or chosen the wrong person. Consider the person you were 10 years ago, and notice how fundamentally different you are today in almost every measurable way, yet you somehow feel like the same continuous self moving through time. Your body has replaced nearly all of its cells, your beliefs have shifted on countless topics, Your preferences in music and food and relationships have transformed completely, and your understanding of yourself and your place in the world has evolved in ways that would be unrecognizable to your younger self. Yet there exists this persistent illusion of a stable core, a fixed self that remains unchanged beneath all these modifications and transformations. The truth is that what you call your identity is less like a solid object and more like a river that never contains the same water twice, and we have simply learned to name the river and pretend that the name represents something permanent. Every moment of your life, you are being shaped by the people around you, the media you consume, the experiences that happen to you, and the chemical fluctuations in your brain, and each of these forces is subtly rewriting who you are at the most fundamental level. You are not even the same person from one conversation to the next, because you adjust your personality and values and sense of humor based on who you are talking to. Yet we have collectively agreed to ignore this fragmentation and refer to ourselves as if we were singular, coherent entities. The disturbing part is that despite knowing this intellectually, despite understanding that identity is fluid and constructed and constantly shifting, we continue to make permanent decisions and forge unchanging beliefs and build rigid self-concepts that we defend fiercely, all while standing on ground that is moving beneath us in ways we do not even notice or acknowledge. Consider the fundamental nature of your awareness in this moment, the continuous stream of experience that feels so persistent and unquestionable, that sense of being present and observing the world around you, and then contemplate the distinct possibility that it might simply cease to exist entirely without warning or transition. Death presents itself as one of the few absolute certainties in human existence, yet consciousness itself remains utterly mysterious in its origins and mechanisms, operating according to principles we do not fully understand despite centuries of scientific advancement and philosophical inquiry. When your brain ceases its electrical and chemical functions, there exists no established mechanism by which your subjective experience, your sense of self, your continuity of awareness could possibly persist in any recognizable form, which means that everything that constitutes your inner life, every memory, every feeling, every thought you have ever held, exists only as long as those neural patterns continue firing in the physical substrate of your brain. The psychological mechanism that allows us to tolerate this reality is a peculiar form of cognitive evasion, a constant background assumption that death is something that happens to other people, to those in distant times or at advanced ages, but not to us, not here, not now, creating what psychologists call an illusion of personal invulnerability that persists despite all rational evidence to the contrary. We have normalized this stunning contradiction by building elaborate cultural narratives around mortality, creating religious frameworks that promise continuity beyond death, developing philosophical systems that reframe mortality as natural and acceptable, and simply maintaining enough psychological distance from the concept that we can function in daily life without constantly confronting the void. Consider the vast machinery of human civilization, the countless hours spent working toward goals, building legacies, accumulating achievements, and establishing meaning in our lives, and then consider that none of it has inherent value written into the fabric of the universe. When you remove the human perspective entirely, when you imagine the cosmos continuing forward without a single conscious observer, your accomplishments, your relationships, your suffering, and your joy all become equally meaningless in the objective sense. The promotion you sought exists only as valuable because you decided it was. The legacy you hope to leave behind will eventually dissolve into dust alongside everyone who might have remembered it, and the love you feel for another person is simply electrical impulses and chemical reactions that your brain has learned to interpret as profound. This is the essence of objective meaninglessness. Nothing carries weight or significance independent of a conscious mind, assigning it those qualities. Mechanism behind this troubling reality operates at the most fundamental level of existence. Objective meaning would require some external, universal scorekeeper or cosmic ledger that determines what truly matters, some external force that says this action counts and that one does not, yet no such arbiter exists or has ever existed. Everything we call meaningful is subjective value projected outward, a story we tell ourselves with such conviction that we forget it began as fiction. Yet despite understanding this intellectually, despite knowing that meaning is self-generated and therefore fundamentally optional, we persist in acting as though our pursuits matter deeply, as though the outcomes of our efforts genuinely impact some universal balance sheet. Consider for a moment the nature of your memories, those vivid recollections you carry with you every single day, the experiences you swear happened to you with absolute certainty, the moments that shaped who you are right now in this present instance. When you recall your childhood home, the face of someone you loved, the conversation you had yesterday, you are not actually accessing the past itself. You are only accessing a neural pattern, a reconstruction, a story your brain has woven together in this moment right now, in the only time that has ever truly existed. The past has no location, no substance, no tangible reality beyond the electrochemical firing of your neurons at this precise second. What you call memory is merely a present moment phenomenon that references something that no longer exists and has not existed for any amount of time. Your brain does not store perfect recordings like a video camera would. Instead, it stores fragments and associations and emotional colorations, and every single time you remember something, you are reconstructing it anew, changing it slightly, contaminating it with current emotions and current knowledge and current perspective. This means that the past you remember is not the past that actually occurred, if we can even use the word occurred about something that has dissolved entirely into nothingness. The only moment that has ever possessed any reality is this one, the eternal now, the continuous present that flows forward without ever stopping, and everything behind it has become nothing more than information encoded in matter and consciousness. We desperately cling to the idea that the past was real and solid and unchangeable because it provides us with a sense of continuity, with identity, with the illusion that we are the same person we were yesterday and last year and in our childhood. Consider the possibility that your future has already been decided, not by fate or destiny in the mystical sense, but by the simple mathematics of cause and effect operating within a deterministic universe where every action cascades inevitably from prior conditions. If we accept that the universe operates according to physical laws, that atoms and molecules follow predictable patterns, and that your brain is ultimately a collection of physical matter governed by these same laws, then the logical conclusion becomes difficult to escape. Every choice you believe you are making freely might already be encoded in the current state of reality, awaiting only the passage of time to reveal itself. Your sense of agency, that feeling that you are consciously choosing your path forward, may be nothing more than an elaborate illusion created by your brain after decisions have already been determined by neurochemistry and prior circumstances beyond your control. You were born into a specific time period, with specific genetics, into a specific family situation, in a specific geographical location, and all of these factors began shaping your neural pathways from infancy in ways you had no say in whatsoever. The books you read, the people you met, the traumas you experienced, the fortunate breaks you received, none of these were truly chosen by some free conscious self. They emerged from probability and circumstance. Perhaps your future career, your relationships, your major life decisions are already written in the fabric of physical causality, and you are simply the conscious witness to their unfolding rather than their architect. This thought persists in human consciousness despite our desperate need to believe otherwise, because acknowledging it would require us to fundamentally restructure our understanding of responsibility, morality, and meaning itself. Consider the moment you walk into a room full of strangers, or even a gathering of people you know well. There is an immediate shift in your behavior, a subtle recalibration of your voice, your posture, your laugh, the stories you choose to tell. You present a version of yourself that feels appropriate for that specific context, whether that means being more reserved with your boss, more animated with old friends, or more agreeable with your partner's family. This is not something you consciously decide to do in most cases, yet it happens automatically, like your brain has thousands of pre-recorded versions of yourself filed away and ready to deploy depending on the audience. At work, you maintain a professional demeanor that might be entirely absent when you are alone at home. On social media, you curate a highlight reel that represents perhaps 5% of your actual existence. Even in intimate relationships, there are aspects of yourself you hold back, performances you maintain to preserve the dynamic you both have agreed upon. The psychological mechanism behind this behavior is rooted in something called impression management, the human tendency to control how others perceive us. Our brains evolved in small groups where reputation was literally a matter of survival, where being perceived as trustworthy or capable could mean the difference between being included in hunts or being cast out entirely. This ancient survival mechanism remains embedded in our modern minds, compelling us to constantly monitor how we are being received and adjust our presentation accordingly. We have normalized this performance so thoroughly that most people move through their entire lives without recognizing that they are never truly being their authentic self in the presence of others. Consider the moment you decide to be authentic, to strip away the masks and present your true self to the world, and notice what happens immediately. The very act of consciously choosing to be authentic transforms that authenticity into performance. You become aware of yourself being yourself, which means you are now performing the role of someone being authentic rather than simply existing in that state. Every text message you craft, every conversation you prepare for, every moment you decide to reveal something genuine about yourself involves a selection process, a curation of which truths to share and which to withhold, which aspects of your inner life are appropriate for which audience. The person you are with your closest family differs from the person you are at work, who differs from the person you are online, and none of these versions is more authentically you than the others because you genuinely contain multitudes. Your personality shifts based on context, social pressure, power dynamics, and the presence of witnesses, which means there is no fixed authentic self waiting to be discovered and expressed. Psychology confirms this through decades of research showing that we are fundamentally relational beings whose sense of self is constructed through interaction rather than existing as some immutable core waiting to be unveiled. We have normalized the pursuit of authenticity anyway, made it a moral imperative and a consumer identity, selling ourselves the idea that somewhere beneath the layers exists a true version of ourselves worth excavating and sharing, when the uncomfortable reality is that the layers themselves are the authentic self, that multiplicity and contradiction and context-dependent behavior are not corruptions of some pure inner essence, but rather the actual substance of human consciousness. Consider the vast majority of people you have encountered throughout your entire life, classmates from elementary school, coworkers from jobs you left years ago, neighbors you lived beside for months, acquaintances you spent entire afternoons with, people whose names you once knew well enough to write on birthday cards, and whose faces you could once recognize instantly. Now consider how many of these individuals actually remember you with any clarity or specificity whatsoever. The honest answer is almost none of them, and the mechanisms behind this forgetting are both scientific and inevitable. Human memory operates with severe constraints, prioritizing only the information that seems immediately relevant to survival and social status, which means that once someone exits your life, the neural pathways associated with them begin deteriorating almost immediately. A person you spent time with regularly will begin fading from another person's memory within weeks of your last interaction, and within months they become less a fully formed individual and more a vague impression, a shadow of a name, a context without detail. This is not a failure of affection or respect, but rather the simple biology of how human brains allocate their limited storage capacity, focusing resources on present relationships and immediate threats while allowing past acquaintances to dissolve into the background noise of forgotten faces. Yet what makes this particularly unsettling is not merely that people forget you, but that they forget you completely and without hesitation, that your existence and your efforts and the time you spent together simply cease to occupy any meaningful space in their consciousness. Even people who claim to care about you, who smiled at you with apparent warmth, who promised to stay in touch, will find that within a remarkably short period, you have become invisible in their minds, and if they happen to encounter your name again or see you experience a moment of genuine joy. Perhaps you receive good news, accomplish something meaningful, or share a laugh with someone you love. And in that instant, your brain floods with dopamine, serotonin, and endorphins, creating a sensation of profound well-being that feels like it could last forever. Yet within hours or days, sometimes even minutes, that chemical cascade subsides, your neural receptors recalibrate to this new baseline, and you find yourself return to your ordinary state of consciousness, left chasing that elevated feeling like a ghost that can never quite be grasped again. The disturbing truth is that your happiness is fundamentally a temporary neurochemical event, not a permanent state of being, which means that even your greatest achievements and most treasured moments are biochemically designed to fade into mere memory, leaving you perpetually incomplete in the present moment. Your brain has evolved this way because constant dopamine would render you incapable of responding to new challenges and dangers, but this mechanism ensures that contentment is always an illusion in motion, always retreating just as you think you have finally secured it. We have normalized this exhausting cycle by framing happiness as something to be pursued and obtained, as though it were a destination you could arrive at and remain, when in fact it operates more like a fleeting shadow that moves across your consciousness before disappearing entirely. You spend your entire existence chasing recapitulation of these chemical moments, structuring your goals and relationships around the hope that you might recreate that feeling, never quite accepting that impermanence is not a bug in the system of human emotion, but rather the very feature that defines it. Consider the peculiar architecture of human progress and growth, where almost every meaningful achievement in our lives appears inextricably bound to some form of suffering or hardship that precedes it. The athlete who wishes to build strength must endure the pain of muscle breakdown and fatigue. The student seeking mastery must sit through the frustration of confusion and repeated failure. The person pursuing emotional maturity must navigate the anguish of loss, disappointment, and confrontation with their own limitations. We have constructed an entire system of meaning around the premise that suffering is not merely an unfortunate byproduct of growth, but rather a necessary catalyst for it, almost as if pleasure and comfort are fundamentally incompatible with becoming better versions of ourselves. This belief operates so deeply in our cultural consciousness that we rarely question whether the equation itself might be flawed, whether we have simply become accustomed to organizing our lives around unnecessary pain because earlier generations did the same. The psychological mechanism supporting this assumption is partially rooted in contrast. We genuinely do appreciate achievements more fully when they required sacrifice, and our brains register accomplishments with greater neurological reward when they involved struggle. Yet somewhere along the way, this observation about human psychology transformed into a prescriptive moral framework, a commandment that suffering is the price of admission to any meaningful experience, that comfort is somehow morally suspect, and that ease is a warning sign of insufficient growth. We have normalized the idea that life must be difficult to be worthwhile, that happiness without hardship is shallow, that protection from pain is actually a form of damage, creating generations of people who unconsciously sabotage their own peace in pursuit of a suffering-earned authenticity that may never have needed to. Consider the life of someone who believes they are in control, who wakes each morning with a plan, who carefully arranges their schedule, organizes their finances, and makes deliberate choices about their career and relationships, only to have their employer eliminate their position without warning, or to receive a diagnosis that reorders their entire existence, or to watch their carefully saved money lose value overnight through forces entirely beyond their comprehension. The human brain is fundamentally wired to perceive itself as the agent of its own destiny, to attribute outcomes to its own actions rather than to chance or systemic forces, because this illusion serves an evolutionary purpose that once helped us survive in unpredictable environments. We need to feel in control because the alternative, the acknowledgement that our lives are substantially shaped by factors we cannot influence, would paralyze us with existential dread. Yet the evidence surrounds us constantly that our control extends far narrower than we imagine. We cannot control our genetic inheritance, the era into which we were born, the economic systems that govern our survival, the health of our bodies as they deteriorate, the choices and actions of other people, or the countless invisible variables that cascade through complex systems to create the circumstances of our lives. We exercise control only within an infinitesimally small window, making minor adjustments to a trajectory that was largely set before our consciousness began, and yet we cling fiercely to the belief that we are steering ourselves through life with intention and precision. This illusion persists because admitting its falsity would undermine the motivational structures that allow us to function at all, and because we have built entire civilizations on the premise that individuals are responsible for their outcomes, a convenient fiction that allows societies to reward the fortunate and punish the unfortunate. There exists a peculiar paradox at the heart of human existence, one that becomes increasingly apparent the more we learn about the world around us and within ourselves. The accumulation of knowledge, which we have been taught since childhood to pursue relentlessly, often serves as a direct pathway to greater suffering and discontent. Consider the person who remains blissfully unaware of their own mortality, living each day in an almost naive contentment, compared to the individual who has studied human biology, statistics, and the inevitability of death, forced to carry that knowledge like a weight upon their shoulders. The more we understand about how the world actually functions, the more we recognize the fragility of our circumstances, the corruption embedded in our systems, the suffering of others we cannot alleviate, and the ultimate meaninglessness that many philosophies suggest underlies existence itself. This mechanism operates because ignorance provides a form of psychological insulation, a protective barrier that allows us to maintain optimism and continue functioning without being paralyzed by the full weight of reality. Each new piece of information about injustice, environmental collapse, historical atrocities, or personal health risks removes another layer of that protective barrier, leaving us more exposed to anxiety, despair, and existential dread. What makes this particularly troubling is that we have constructed an entire civilization that valorizes knowledge acquisition as the ultimate good, encouraging endless learning without acknowledging the psychological cost of this pursuit. We have normalized the idea that ignorance is shameful and knowledge is virtue, never pausing to consider whether some unknowing might actually be preferable to awareness of truths that bring only suffering without corresponding power to change them. There exists a peculiar asymmetry in human experience where the loss of innocence operates as a one-directional passage that cannot be reversed or undone, no matter how desperately we might wish to return to that earlier state of unknowing. When a child first understands that people they trusted have lied to them, or when they witness cruelty for the first time, or when they become aware of mortality, suffering, injustice, or their own vulnerability, something fundamental shifts in their perception that cannot be unlearned or forgotten. The knowledge settles into their consciousness like sediment in water, and even if they try to look away or convince themselves otherwise, the awareness remains embedded, coloring all subsequent experiences and interpretations of the world. We see this pattern repeating across countless moments of human development. The moment a person learns that their parents are flawed and fallible, the instant someone realizes that love does not always prevent abandonment or pain, the day a young person understands that the rules they were taught do not apply equally to everyone, the hour they discover their own capacity for selfishness or cruelty. The mechanism behind this irreversibility stems from the nature of memory and cognition itself, for the brain does not truly erase information once it has been integrated. It merely creates new pathways and contexts around it, but the original knowledge persists in the foundation. Unlike physical injuries that can sometimes heal completely, returning tissue to its original state, the wound of lost innocence is fundamentally neurological and existential, altering the very architecture of how someone perceives reality. We have collectively accepted this as inevitable and unchangeable, weaving it into coming-of-age narratives and marking it as a necessary passage into adulthood, yet we rarely pause to contemplate the tragedy embedded within this acceptance, the quiet acknowledged. Every single time you extend trust to another human being, you are engaging in an act of profound gambling, yet we rarely acknowledge this fundamental truth about human relationships and social interactions. When you tell someone a secret, you are betting that they will not weaponize that information against you, and when you lend money to a friend, you are wagering that their financial circumstances will not change in a way that makes them unable or unwilling to repay you. And when you leave your child with a babysitter, you are placing an enormous bet on their character and judgment in a moment when you cannot observe what happens. The mechanism behind this is straightforward and unavoidable. You cannot truly know another person's interior world, their future decisions, or their capacity to act with integrity under pressure, which means every act of trust is fundamentally a decision made with incomplete information, the precise definition of a gamble. We have no way to peek behind the curtain of another person's mind to verify that their values align with ours, or that they will maintain their commitments when no one is watching, or when doing so becomes inconvenient. So we must simply accept uncertainty and extend our trust anyway. What makes this particularly unsettling is that we have systematized and normalized this uncertainty to such a degree that we no longer recognize it as the tremendous risk it actually represents. And we move through our entire lives making these bets constantly, without ever pausing to acknowledge that we are essentially throwing dice every time we believe in someone or depend on them. We call it faith or confidence, but underneath the comfortable language is the stark reality that we are all wagering pieces of ourselves, our security, and our futures on the gamble that other people will behave as we hope they will, knowing with absolute certainty that sometimes they will not. When you lock your door at night, you are engaging in a ritual that feels protective, but is ultimately an illusion masquerading as control. The lock on your door is merely a suggestion to potential intruders, a polite request that they find an easier target elsewhere, and any determined person with basic tools can bypass it within minutes. Yet we perform this nightly ceremony with the sincere belief that we have secured our spaces, our possessions, and our families, when in reality we have only created a psychological comfort that bears no relationship to actual protection. This extends far beyond physical barriers into every domain of human existence. The job you depend on for survival can disappear overnight due to market forces beyond your comprehension or influence. The retirement accounts you have carefully cultivated throughout your entire career can evaporate in market crashes triggered by decisions made in boardrooms you will never enter. Your health, which feels stable and reliable on most days, remains hostage to genetic predispositions, environmental toxins, and random biological failures that no amount of precaution can entirely prevent. The fundamental mechanism driving this disconnect is that humans require the sensation of security to function psychologically, even though security is essentially impossible in a universe governed by entropy and change. Our brains evolved to detect threats and create defenses, but they did not evolve to accept the genuine randomness and chaos that governs existence. So we construct elaborate systems of false security, from insurance policies that cover only specific scenarios to security systems that can be circumvented, to the belief that following rules and working hard will guarantee a stable future. There exists a peculiar phenomenon in human experience where the years between adolescence and early adulthood slip away almost entirely unnoticed, consumed by obligations that feel urgent in the moment but leave no lasting impression upon reflection. Young people find themselves moving through structured systems, educational institutions, entry-level employment, social hierarchies, operating under the assumption that these are merely temporary phases before real life begins. Yet these years represent perhaps the most valuable period of existence, when physical capability peaks, curiosity remains highest, and the freedom to experiment and fail carries the fewest consequences. The squandering occurs not through dramatic misuse, but through a quiet acceptance of defaults. Attending classes without questioning their relevance, working jobs that feel temporary while postponing meaningful pursuits, spending evenings scrolling through the curated lives of others instead of building one's own, postponing travel because it seems like something to do later, avoiding difficult conversations and relationships because there will be time for those things eventually, consuming entertainment passively when the energy and mental clarity to create something original will never again be so abundant. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon is fundamentally rooted in the human inability to truly comprehend exponential scarcity in the present moment. Time feels infinite when experienced day by day, and the brain lacks the capacity to translate abstract future regret into immediate present motivation, so young people default to whatever path offers the least resistance today, believing they will redirect their energy tomorrow, next month, or next year. Consider the weight that builds silently within us across the decades of living, the collection of moments we wish we had handled differently, choices we wish we could unmake, words we wish we could take back, and opportunities we wish we had seized when they were presented to us. Each regret, no matter how small it seems in the moment of its creation, deposits itself into a chamber of the mind where it settles and compounds, mixing with all the other regrets that have come before it, creating a psychological sediment that grows heavier with every passing year. We make a decision to stay silent when we should have spoken, and that regret finds a place to rest. And then years later we make another similar choice, and another regret joins the first one, and they begin to reinforce each other, creating patterns of accumulated dissatisfaction that become increasingly difficult to ignore. The mechanism that drives this accumulation is both simple and relentless. Human memory does not naturally release negative experiences, it clings to them, examines them repeatedly from different angles, and each examination adds another layer to the regret without actually changing its fundamental nature. We are creatures designed to learn from mistakes, and that learning capacity requires that we remember our failures vividly, which means that the moments we wish we could erase instead become the moments we cannot forget, cementing themselves into our sense of self and our understanding of who we are and what we are capable of. What makes this particularly insidious is that regrets rarely exist in isolation. They connect to other regrets, they create chains of consequence that extend backward and forward through our timeline, and we find ourselves not just regretting individual moments, but regretting the patterns those moments represent, the version of ourselves that made those choices, the years that we cannot recover. Consider the ordinary moment when someone begins to speak, their mouth opening to form words, their lungs preparing to push air through their vocal cords, their brain firing the neural sequences that will construct meaning and deliver it into the world. And then, without warning or transition, death arrives and interrupts the utterance entirely. A person collapses mid-word, their sentence fragmenting into silence, the final thought they were about to express dissolving into the void before it could reach another's ears. This happens thousands of times each day across the planet, in hospitals and homes and public spaces, individuals caught between the intention to communicate and the actual completion of that communication, their final message left eternally incomplete. The brain simply stops processing, the heart ceases its rhythm, and whatever they were about to say becomes permanently lost, a sentence with no ending, a thought with no conclusion. The psychological weight of this reality stems from our fundamental assumption that life operates within comprehensible narrative arcs, that we somehow earn the right to finish our thoughts, to complete our stories, to have closure in our final moments. Yet this assumption has no basis in the actual mechanics of existence, and death respects no such courtesy or timing. A person might be in the middle of confessing something important, or sharing a joke, or arguing a point, or declaring love, and none of that matters to the biological systems that have simply decided to fail. We have normalized the incompleteness of human life by creating stories where people die with dignity, where final words are profound and memorable, where the end is somehow tidy and appropriate. But the truth persists beneath these comforting narratives. Most people do not get to finish what they are saying, most final statements are mundane or cut short, and most deaths occur in the middle of something that felt important. We spend roughly 6 years of our lives dreaming, and for centuries we have treated these nocturnal narratives as if they contain profound truths about our inner worlds, our desires, our futures, and our deepest fears. We wake from vivid dreams convinced that they mean something significant, that they are messages from our unconscious minds trying to tell us what we truly need or what we should avoid. We pay therapists to analyze them, we consult dream dictionaries that promise to decode their symbolism, we share them with friends and family members who nod knowingly as if they possess some special interpretive wisdom. Yet the uncomfortable reality is that dreams reveal almost nothing of actual value about who we are or what we need to know. Dreams are the brain's cleanup process, a neurological maintenance routine where random neural firing patterns create the illusion of narrative and meaning where none actually exists. When your brain is consolidating memories during rapid eye movement sleep, it is not crafting secret messages for you to decipher. It is simply performing essential housekeeping, pruning unnecessary synaptic connections and strengthening important ones. The storylines that feel so profound and symbolic are merely the brain's attempt to construct coherence from essentially random activation patterns. You do not need to understand why you dreamed about drowning or falling or being chased, because there is no deeper reason to understand. The symbolic interpretation we layer onto dreams is something we construct ourselves after the fact, and we could construct almost any meaning we wanted if we tried hard enough. Yet we have collectively decided to treat dreams as if they are prophetic or revealing, creating entire industries around their supposed interpretation. Consider the vast majority of human beings who walk this earth, each one arriving with a constellation of dormant abilities, latent talents, and unrealized capacities that will never fully manifest or be developed during their lifetime. A child might possess an extraordinary gift for mathematics or music or visual art or leadership or scientific innovation, yet circumstances of birth, economic hardship, lack of mentorship, wrong timing, or simple indifference will ensure that this potential remains locked away, never to flourish or contribute to the world in any meaningful way. The statistical reality is rather bleak. Most people will live and die having accessed only a fraction of what they were genuinely capable of becoming or achieving, their dormant talents fading quietly into non-existence without ever leaving a trace. This occurs because potential requires not only innate ability, but also opportunity, resources, encouragement, timing, access to education and networks, freedom from survival anxiety, and sustained motivation over many years. A constellation of factors that most human beings simply do not possess simultaneously. The mechanism underlying this waste is deeply structural, rooted in how societies allocate resources, how families function within economic constraints, how schools fail to identify and nurture individual strengths, and how most people become trapped in cycles of routine obligation that consume all available mental energy and attention. We normalize this tragedy so completely that we rarely stop to acknowledge the staggering human loss occurring all around us, instead accepting as natural that some people will be discovered and developed, while countless others remain forever undiscovered, their private capabilities irrelevant to a world that never knew they existed, and we collectively continue forward, as though this arrangement represents not a profound failure of human civilization, but merely the way things am. Consider how you arrived at your political beliefs, your views on parenting, your stance on what makes someone successful, or your opinions about which foods are disgusting and which are delicious. If you trace these convictions back to their origin, you will likely discover that most of them were not forged through personal experience or rigorous independent thought, but rather absorbed silently from the people around you during your formative years. Your parents held certain views about money and social class, and without any formal instruction, you internalized their tone of voice when discussing wealthy people or poor people. Your peers expressed judgments about attractiveness and status, and through mere exposure and subtle social reinforcement, those preferences became your own. The media you consumed presented narratives about what relationships should look like, what ambitions are worth pursuing, and what kinds of people deserve respect, and you absorbed these frameworks so completely that you now experience them as your authentic beliefs rather than as inherited scripts. The mechanism behind this process is profoundly simple yet deeply disquieting. The human brain is fundamentally an imitation machine designed to learn survival strategies and social protocols from observation rather than from explicit instruction. Your consciousness does not possess the bandwidth to evaluate every single belief independently, so it outsources this labor to a psychological shortcut called conformity bias, which makes adopting the opinions of your tribe feel effortless and natural. Furthermore, once an opinion has been held for long enough, it becomes neurologically integrated into your sense of identity, making it feel like it emerged from your own reasoning rather than from external absorption. What persists despite this mechanism being widely understood is our stubborn refusal to acknowledge how colonized our minds truly are. Consider the moment you believe you have conceived of something entirely new, a thought that feels authentic and born from your own consciousness. Yet when you examine it carefully, you discover that this idea has been circulating through culture for years, expressed in books you have read, conversations you have overheard, videos you have consumed, and articles that have passed through your awareness in ways you no longer consciously remember. The human mind operates as a vast recombination engine, taking existing information and rearranging it in patterns that feel novel to us precisely because we have forgotten their origins. And this fundamental truth about cognition means that genuinely original thoughts, those that emerge without any precedent anywhere in human knowledge, are extraordinarily rare and perhaps functionally impossible to create. Our brains are shaped by everything we have ever encountered, from the language we speak to the cultural narratives we absorb to the logical frameworks we have internalized through education and experience. And each of these elements constrains the possible thoughts we can generate within predetermined boundaries that were established long before we were born. The psychological mechanism at work here involves what researchers call source amnesia, whereby we remember the content of an idea but forget where we learned it, creating the powerful illusion that we have independently arrived at conclusions that we have actually simply absorbed and repackaged. We have normalized this state of intellectual dependency by celebrating individual creativity and original thinking as virtues, while simultaneously failing to acknowledge the impossibility of true originality given the nature of human memory and culture. And this contradiction persists, because accepting it would require us to fundamentally reconsider our understanding of individual achievement and personal identity. Consider the person you believe yourself to be, that consistent sense of identity you carry through each day, the particular way you react to situations, your preferences, your quirks, your moral intuitions, and your emotional responses. Most of what you experience as your genuine personality is not an expression of some deep, authentic self, but rather the accumulated programming of your environment, your upbringing, your culture, the media you consumed during critical developmental windows, the conversations you had with specific people at specific times, and the neurochemical patterns that were literally etched into your brain during formative years. Your sense of humor, shaped by what made your family laugh when you were young, your taste in music or food, influenced by what surrounded you in childhood, your political beliefs, largely inherited from your parents or your peer group, your moral outrage at certain injustices, determined partly by what your culture emphasizes as valuable. When you make a choice, when you feel a spontaneous emotional reaction, when you express what you think is your authentic preference, you are often simply executing the programming that was installed long before you had any say in the matter. The disturbing part is how seamlessly this feels like genuine self-expression, how completely you identify with these programmed responses as if they emerged from some core essence of who you truly are. You can change aspects of your personality through conscious effort and new experiences, yes, but the fact remains that you begin this process already heavily weighted by inputs you never chose. Most people spend their entire lives entirely unaware of how much of their supposed personality is simply the output of environmental variables, as if they are characters in a story written before they were born, playing out their lines while believing they are spontaneously improvising. Consider the narrative we've constructed around excellence. The starving artist in their cramped studio, the athlete training through pain and injury, the musician practicing until their fingers bleed, the writer torturing themselves through endless revisions and rejection. We celebrate these stories of suffering as prerequisites for greatness, as though pain were a necessary ingredient in the recipe for talent rather than merely an unfortunate circumstance that often accompanies the pursuit of mastery. The mechanism behind this belief runs deep into how we process struggle and achievement together. When we witness someone succeed after visible hardship, our brains create a causal link between the two, assuming that the suffering produced the talent, when in reality the talent might have emerged regardless, and the suffering was simply the price paid by someone determined enough to pursue it despite the obstacles. We have normalized this equation so thoroughly that we now actively romanticize the suffering itself, treating difficulty as a badge of authenticity and legitimacy. Young people entering creative fields are told they must starve, must sacrifice their health, must endure rejection and poverty as though these trials were forged fires that would temper their gifts into something stronger. Yet this belief persists despite having no logical foundation whatsoever. Talent is a combination of natural aptitude, deliberate practice, opportunity, and time, none of which inherently require suffering. A person could theoretically develop extraordinary skill in a supportive environment with adequate resources and encouragement, yet we resist this possibility because it conflicts with our deeply held mythology that meaningful achievement must be earned through pain. When a person achieves significant success, whether through career advancement, financial gain, or public recognition, they often find themselves standing alone in ways they never anticipated, surrounded by admirers and associates, yet profoundly disconnected from genuine human connection and meaningful relationships. The successful individual discovers that the people around them have shifted their perception, no longer seeing them as they were before, but instead viewing them through the lens of their accomplishments, their wealth, or their status, which creates an invisible barrier that prevents authentic interaction. Friends from before success often feel uncomfortable in the new social strata, unable to relate to the experiences and opportunities now available, while new acquaintances approach with ulterior motives, wanting something from the successful person rather than wanting to know who they actually are beneath the accolades. This isolation stems from a fundamental psychological mechanism. Success changes the power dynamic in relationships, introducing questions of whether affection is genuine or motivated by association with achievement, and whether vulnerabilities can be shared without becoming weapons or leverage in the hands of those who might benefit from knowing them. The successful person begins to distrust the motivations of others and guards their authentic self behind professional personas and curated versions of their lives, creating distance even when surrounded by crowds. What makes this phenomenon particularly troubling is that we have normalized it as the inevitable price of achievement, as though the trade-off between connection and accomplishment is somehow natural and unchangeable, when in reality it reflects our deeper cultural belief that people have value proportional to their productivity and status. Every person who has ever attempted something meaningful has encountered failure, yet almost universally, we treat it as something to be ashamed of rather than learned from, creating a peculiar paradox where the most effective teacher in human experience remains one of the most avoided and suppressed. When you fail at a task, your brain actually undergoes a sophisticated process of pattern recognition and neural reorganization that doesn't occur during success, where the surprise of an unexpected outcome triggers deeper analysis and memory consolidation, essentially encoding the lesson more permanently than any successful attempt ever could. A musician who plays a piece perfectly learns less from that performance than the musician who stumbles on a difficult passage and must figure out why. A student who receives a failing grade on an exam often retains more information than one who barely passes. And an entrepreneur whose business fails typically possesses more practical wisdom than one whose first venture succeeded by luck. The mechanism behind this is rooted in our brain's attention system, which allocates cognitive resources primarily to unexpected or negative outcomes, forcing us to examine our assumptions, reconsider our methods, and build more robust mental models of how the world actually functions rather than how we believed it functioned. Yet despite this being demonstrably true and observable throughout history in nearly every field of human achievement, we have constructed an entire cultural apparatus designed to minimize, hide, and pathologize failure, teaching children from their earliest years that mistakes are indicators of personal inadequacy rather than opportunities for growth, instilling shame responses that actually inhibit the very learning process that failure naturally enables. Consider the person who has settled into a stable job, a reliable routine, a predictable life where the variables are controlled and the future feels secure, and you will find someone who has made a silent bargain with stagnation without fully understanding the terms. The human organism, like all living systems, requires resistance to develop strength, requires challenge to sharpen capability, requires the friction of difficulty to forge competence and resilience. Yet comfort, by its very nature, eliminates these necessary pressures. When your environment provides everything you need without demanding anything from you, when your days unfold predictably and your survival feels assured, the machinery of growth simply switches off because it no longer serves an evolutionary purpose. The brain recognizes safety and begins to conserve energy, to optimize for efficiency rather than adaptation, to rely on existing neural pathways rather than carving new ones. This is not a flaw but a feature of human physiology, yet it operates as a trap because the comfort that feels like achievement is actually the beginning of decline. What makes this particularly insidious is how we have normalized the pursuit of comfort as the ultimate life goal, structuring our entire existence around eliminating struggle, around building buffers against uncertainty, around creating conditions where nothing difficult ever needs to happen to us again. We tell ourselves this is wisdom, this is earned rest, this is what success looks like, when in reality we have built elaborate mechanisms for our own psychological diminishment. The person who fears taking risks, who stays in relationships that no longer challenge them, who chooses the known over the unknown, who optimizes for safety at the expense of purpose, is not actually living safely at all, but rather slowly ceasing to live in any meaningful sense. Consider the modern human existence, wrapped in layers of protective infrastructure that our ancestors could never have imagined. We have engineered our lives to minimize risk at nearly every turn, surrounding ourselves with guardrails, safety protocols, insurance policies, and institutional oversight designed to catch us before we fall. Yet within this cocoon of security, something troubling has taken root. The more safely we live, the smaller our sense of capability becomes, until the mere prospect of genuine uncertainty paralyses us with anxiety. A person who has never experienced meaningful hardship, who has never faced genuine consequences for failure, develops a psychological fragility that no amount of comfort can cure. This is the paradox that unfolds quietly in protected lives. When every physical danger is engineered away, when every financial risk is hedged through systems beyond our control, when every social embarrassment is minimized by anonymity and digital distance, we lose the fundamental knowledge that we are capable of enduring difficulty. The mechanism is straightforward. Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the willingness to act despite fear, and this willingness atrophies without practice. A child who has never scraped a knee, never failed publicly, never faced genuine social rejection, enters adulthood with no experiential evidence that these things are survivable. The psychological result is that small challenges feel insurmountable because they have never developed the internal reference point of resilience. We have normalized this inversion so completely that we now call this fragility, sensitivity, and wisdom, medicalizing the natural responses of an organism that has never had to test its own strength. The safe life becomes a prison of perceived limitations. Consider the person who has decided exactly what they believe about politics, religion, economics, or human nature, and from that moment forward, every piece of information they encounter is filtered through the lens of that predetermined conclusion. They watch news that confirms their view, read articles that align with their position, and surround themselves with people who think identically. And in this constructed environment, their certainty only deepens with each passing day. The mechanism at work here is deceptively simple. Once the mind commits to a position with confidence, it begins the unconscious process of dismissing contradictory evidence as propaganda, bias, or exception rather than signal. This is not a flaw unique to unintelligent people. It is perhaps most dangerous in the highly educated and articulate, who possess the cognitive tools to construct elaborate intellectual frameworks that justify their original certainty while making alternative perspectives seem not just wrong, but intellectually inferior. The brain does not actually want to be right in some objective sense. It wants to maintain internal consistency and avoid the psychological discomfort of contradiction, and certainty provides a perfect shield against that discomfort by making all future information subordinate to what has already been decided. What makes this particularly disturbing is how certainty masquerades as enlightenment, how the person who is most certain they understand the world is often the person most insulated from actually learning anything new about it. We have normalized this phenomenon so thoroughly that we celebrate it as conviction, as having principles, as knowing what you believe, when in reality it may be nothing more than sophisticated self-delusion operating at full capacity. The more you understand about how the world actually works, the more you find yourself unable to connect with people around you in the way that others seem to connect with each other so effortlessly. Intelligent people often find themselves in situations where they see patterns that others miss, recognize logical fallacies in casual conversation, understand the mechanisms of manipulation and self-deception that drive so much human behavior, and this awareness creates an invisible barrier between them and the rest of the population. They attend social gatherings and listen to conversations that seem to circle endlessly around trivial concerns, watch people make decisions based on incomplete information or cognitive biases they cannot unsee once recognized, and feel a profound disconnection from the comfort that others seem to derive from simple living and uncomplicated thinking. The mechanism behind this phenomenon operates on multiple levels simultaneously. When intelligence develops, it brings with it an expanded capacity for abstract thought, pattern recognition, and the ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, which means that intellectually advanced individuals become acutely aware of nuance, contradiction, and complexity in areas where others see only straightforward answers. They understand that most certainties are actually provisional, that most beliefs are shaped by circumstance rather than logic, and that the comfortable narratives people tell themselves about their lives and choices are often stories designed to maintain psychological comfort rather than reflect truth. This awareness separates them experientially from those still operating within simpler frameworks of understanding, creating a psychological distance that cannot be bridged through effort or intention alone. There exists a peculiar paradox in human relationships where the more thoroughly you come to understand another person, the more distant you may become from them. When you first meet someone, there is a kind of mystery that draws you closer, an endless capacity for projection and imagination about who they might be, what depths they might contain. But as time passes and understanding accumulates through conversation and observation, that mystery dissolves into comprehension, and something shifts in the dynamic between you. You begin to see not the infinite potential of an unknown person, but the finite reality of an actual one, complete with contradictions, limitations, predictable patterns, and ordinary flaws. The understanding you gain becomes a catalog of their shortcomings, their repetitive behaviors, their consistent failures to surprise you, and somehow this knowledge, which should theoretically bring intimacy, instead creates a subtle form of separation. You know exactly how they will respond to certain situations, what they will say in particular moments, and this predictability strips away the element of genuine connection that once existed when you were puzzling them out. Psychologically, this occurs because understanding reduces complexity to manageable patterns, and patterns are inherently less engaging than mysteries. Your brain evolved to seek novel stimuli and solve puzzles, but once a puzzle is solved, once the pattern is recognized, the engagement diminishes. Furthermore, understanding often reveals the mechanical nature of human behavior, showing us that people are largely products of their past, their circumstances, their neurological wiring, and this realization can breed a kind of melancholic acceptance rather than passionate connection. When you truly understand another person's suffering, when you allow yourself to genuinely feel what they feel, something happens inside you that resembles a kind of psychological wound. Imagine witnessing a parent who has lost a child, and rather than observing their pain from a comfortable distance, you let yourself imagine the texture of their grief, the weight of their loss, the particular way their world has collapsed. In that moment of genuine empathy, you are not simply observing their pain, you are experiencing a shadow of it yourself, and that shadow is real enough to cause measurable distress within your own nervous system. The brain does not distinguish cleanly between your suffering and the suffering of another when empathy is activated. Mirror neurons fire, your stress hormones elevate, and your body registers a threat to well-being even though the threat is not technically to you. This is the cruel mechanism at the heart of human connection. The deeper your capacity to understand and feel alongside another person, the more you expose yourself to psychological pain that you did not originate and cannot fully escape. Yet we celebrate empathy as a virtue, we teach children to develop it, we consider it essential to morality and compassion. We have built entire systems of meaning around the idea that feeling what others feel is noble and necessary, even though it causes demonstrable suffering within the person who possesses this capacity. The person who cares deeply experiences more pain than the person who remains isolated and indifferent, and there exists no evolutionary or logical reason why we should expect people to voluntarily choose this path of greater suffering when they could simply reduce their empathy and live more comfortably within the boundaries of their own experience. Consider the couple who has been together for 15 years, who have built a life of mortgages and shared holidays and routines so deeply embedded that they feel like the architecture of existence itself. And yet when one partner finally speaks a truth that has been accumulating like sediment in the depths of their chest, something fundamental cracks and begins to crumble. The truth might be something small, a confession about a minor infidelity or a long-held resentment, or it might be something larger, a revelation that contradicts the entire narrative they have constructed together. And yet the moment those words enter the air between them, they become irrevocable, and the relationship is fundamentally altered in ways that cannot be undone. This pattern repeats across the landscape of human connection, in friendships that suddenly fracture when one person reveals how they truly feel, in families that splinter when buried secrets finally surface, in professional relationships that become unbearably tense once certain truths are acknowledged. The mechanism at work here is that relationships, almost all relationships, are built not upon absolute honesty, but upon a carefully maintained fiction that both parties have agreed to uphold, a shared delusion that allows two or more people to coexist in relative comfort even when fundamental incompatibilities or grievances exist beneath the surface. When honesty disrupts this fiction, it forces both parties to confront reality as it actually is rather than as they have agreed to imagine it. And this confrontation often reveals that the relationship was being sustained primarily by the lies that were told, either actively or through strategic silence and omission. What persists despite the logical understanding that truth should strengthen bonds is the normalization of this paradox, the way we have come to accept that the healthiest relationships are often those where people learn exactly H. Consider the functioning of modern civilization for a moment and recognize that nearly every institution relies upon a delicate ecosystem of comfortable falsehoods, strategic omissions, and agreed-upon fictions that allow people to coexist without constant conflict or existential collapse. Employers tell workers that their contributions matter equally while paying vastly different wages based on factors unrelated to actual output. Politicians promise transformations they know cannot be delivered within their terms. Religious institutions teach certainties about unknowable matters, and families maintain narratives about their own harmony even as resentment festers beneath the surface. The mechanism behind this phenomenon operates through a fundamental recognition that absolute truth creates chaos, that transparency about genuine human motivations and limitations would make cooperation impossible, and that belief in convenient myths allows people to function despite the overwhelming awareness that life contains no inherent meaning or justice. We have constructed our societies upon the understanding that if everyone suddenly acknowledged the arbitrary nature of their rules, the fiction of their leaders' competence, or the fundamental indifference of the universe toward human suffering, the social contract would immediately dissolve into paralysis and violence. Schools teach children that hard work guarantees success, while knowing that circumstance and inherited advantage determine outcomes far more reliably. Corporations advertise products as solutions to problems they themselves created through marketing, and governments maintain security through information carefully withheld from their citizens. The persistence of these lies, despite their irrationality, reveals something profound about human nature itself, which is that we require myths more than we require truth, that we will collectively choose comfortable delusion over uncomfortable really. We live in a peculiar paradox where truth is simultaneously celebrated as the highest virtue and actively avoided whenever it becomes inconvenient or painful. And this contradiction reveals something fundamental about human nature that we rarely acknowledge openly. Consider the person who asks for honest feedback on their appearance, their work, or their life choices, yet visibly recoils when given genuine assessment rather than affirmation, or the organization that claims to value transparency while systematically punishing those who deliver unwelcome information, or the relationships that deteriorate not because of deception, but because one person finally speaks what they have known for years and what the other person genuinely does not wish to hear. The psychological mechanism is straightforward. Truth exists in service of comfort and identity maintenance, and when these two things conflict, comfort wins almost every time, and we have constructed elaborate social systems to ensure that uncomfortable truths are diluted, delayed, or delivered only by those with sufficient authority that they cannot be easily dismissed or punished for the delivery. We tell ourselves that we want honesty while simultaneously rewarding those who tell us what we want to hear and subtly ostracizing those who do not. And this creates a consistent selective pressure toward pleasant falsehood, and most people operate within this system without conscious awareness that they are participating in it. The mother who does not tell her adult child that their spouse is destructive, the friend who watches another make a catastrophic error and says nothing to preserve the relationship, the colleague who remains silent about the failing project to avoid conflict, the nation that propagandizes its own history rather than confronting it directly. These are all examples of the same underlying mechanism, which is that truth is only wanted in the abstract, in the form of historic. Consider the fundamental promise upon which modern civilization claims to rest, that wrongdoing will be punished and the innocent protected through systems of law and order. Yet when you examine the actual distribution of consequences across society, a deeply unsettling pattern emerges where justice appears not as an inherent feature of our world, but as a rare luxury allocated primarily to those with resources and power. The wealthy can afford legal teams that transform culpability into reasonable doubt, while the poor accept plea deals for crimes they may not have committed simply because they cannot afford to fight in court. Corporations that poison communities, exploit workers, and defraud millions settle cases with fines that amount to minor business expenses, penalties so small they become merely the cost of doing business rather than actual accountability. Meanwhile, individuals arrested for minor offenses spend years cycling through the criminal system, accumulating collateral damage to their lives long after their sentence ends. This disparity exists not because the legal system is broken in the mechanical sense, but because justice requires resources that most humans simply do not possess, and the system operates precisely as it was designed to operate, to protect property and power rather than to distribute fairness evenly. We have normalized this contradiction by speaking of the justice system as though it actually delivers justice, by celebrating occasional convictions of powerful people as proof the system works, while ignoring the thousands of cases where the powerless are ground through its machinery. The disturbing truth is that we have constructed an elaborate mythology around justice that allows us to sleep soundly despite living in a world where consequences are almost entirely determined not by the severity of wrongdoing, but by the defendant's financial position, skin color, and social connections. One of the most persistent and damaging illusions we carry from childhood is the belief that fairness is a natural law of the universe, that effort and goodness will be rewarded proportionally, and that life operates according to some fundamental principle of justice. We are taught this through stories, through the structure of schools where grades theoretically reflect merit, through games with explicit rules, and through parental promises that if we behave well and work hard, good things will happen to us. Yet the moment we step into the actual world, we encounter a reality that contradicts this foundational belief at nearly every turn. Two people with identical qualifications apply for the same job, but one gets hired because they happen to know someone on the hiring committee or because they attended a prestigious university that granted them invisible social capital. Two children are born into different circumstances, one to wealthy parents with access to excellent nutrition and education, the other to struggling parents in a food desert with underfunded schools, and their life trajectories diverge dramatically through no fault of their own. The mechanism behind this persistent myth operates through what psychologists call the just world hypothesis, a cognitive bias that makes us desperately want to believe that outcomes correlate with character and effort because the alternative is too unsettling to contemplate. We need to believe the world is fair because it provides a sense of control and predictability. If we can identify the rules, follow them perfectly, we can guarantee success and safety for ourselves and our children. This belief persists even as we accumulate evidence to the contrary throughout our lives, because acknowledging systematic unfairness in the world forces us to confront our own powerlessness and vulnerability. Consider the businessman who systematically cheats his employees out of fair wages, who cuts corners on safety regulations, who knowingly sells products he understands are defective, and yet he accumulates wealth and power, retiring to a sprawling estate where he lives comfortably for decades, never facing consequences, never experiencing the cosmic punishment that the concept of karma suggests should inevitably arrive. Simultaneously, consider the single mother who works 2 jobs, who volunteers at her community center, who gives generously despite having almost nothing, and whose child develops a terminal illness at age 9, whose life becomes defined by medical debt and grief and exhaustion. The universe does not balance these scales. There is no invisible ledger keeping score, no cosmic force ensuring that good deeds are rewarded and cruelty is punished. The mechanism that keeps the karma myth alive in our collective consciousness is fundamentally psychological rather than metaphysical. We desperately want to believe in a just universe because the alternative is too uncomfortable to contemplate. If actions do not have inevitable consequences, if the universe operates on indifference rather than moral accounting, then we are responsible for creating our own justice system, and we must accept that sometimes the guilty escape and the innocent suffer for no reason at all. This belief persists despite overwhelming evidence because it offers comfort, because it suggests that if we simply behave well enough, we can control our fate, we can ensure good things happen to us. It is a form of magical thinking disguised as wisdom, a way of avoiding the difficult truth that the world is fundamentally random and uncaring, that sometimes terrible people live wonderful lives and good people experience unfathomable tragedy, and that the universe neither rewards virtue nor punishes sin with any consistency whatsoever. Consider the person who arrives early to every meeting, who listens intently to others' problems without complaint, who volunteers their time and energy to causes larger than themselves, who maintains their integrity in situations where dishonesty would benefit them greatly, and yet watches as recognition and advancement flow toward those who cut corners, who network strategically while neglecting genuine relationships, who speak loudly about their accomplishments while remaining silent about their failures. The phenomenon of unrewarded goodness is so pervasive that we rarely pause to examine its mechanisms, accepting it instead as simply the way the world operates, a natural consequence of living among people rather than a specific choice we've collectively made. The root of this pattern lies in the fundamental asymmetry between visibility and virtue. Goodness often performs its work quietly, without fanfare or documentation, while self-promotion and strategic maneuvering demand attention and create memorable narratives that others cannot help but notice and reward. A person who helps a colleague might never be acknowledged by anyone beyond that single person, whereas someone who speaks confidently about their contributions creates a persistent record in others' minds that accumulates over time, shaping perceptions of merit and capability that determine raises, promotions, and opportunities. Furthermore, many systems in society are designed to reward measurable outcomes and visible success rather than character and intention, meaning that the quiet fulfillment of helping another human being or maintaining one's principles carries no currency in the economic and social markets that determine our survival and status. We have normalized this injustice by creating narratives around it, telling ourselves stories about how character builds invisibly and will eventually be recognized, or how virtue is its own reward, yet we continue to witness see. Throughout history, we observe a curious and troubling pattern. Acts of cruelty, manipulation, and destruction often require far less effort than acts of genuine kindness and construction. A person can ruin a reputation with a single lie whispered in the right ear, yet rebuilding that same reputation demands months of consistent, virtuous behavior. A tyrant can consolidate power through fear and brutality in weeks, while a just leader must laboriously earn trust through endless compromise and patience. This asymmetry exists because evil operates with a fundamental advantage that goodness simply does not possess. It requires no maintenance of consistency, no adherence to principle, and no concern for consequences beyond the immediate moment. When you choose cruelty, you need not worry about tomorrow's judgment or future accountability. When you lie for personal gain, the path of least resistance opens before you instantly. Goodness, conversely, demands constant vigilance, self-restraint, and the willingness to sacrifice immediate advantage for abstract principles that may never be rewarded. The mechanism behind this imbalance lies in human psychology itself. We are creatures driven by impulse, fear, and the desire for dominance. Cruelty aligns with these base instincts, flowing naturally downstream like water finding its course. Kindness and integrity require us to swim against our nature, to override the immediate signals our minds send us. Society has normalized this disparity by accepting that wickedness is simply easier, more practical, more realistic. We call ruthless people ambitious, call liars shrewd, call the exploitative successful. Evil thrives not because it is stronger, but because goodness has convinced itself that its own standards are too demanding. Consider the child born into poverty in a region ravaged by conflict, who will spend their formative years malnourished, exposed to violence, and denied education through no fault of their own. Consider the person diagnosed with a terminal illness at 30 years old, who never smoked, never drank excessively, and did everything society told them would keep them healthy, yet their body betrays them anyway. Consider the teenager bullied relentlessly by their peers for reasons entirely beyond their control, perhaps their appearance, their family circumstances, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. These individuals did nothing to deserve their suffering, yet the universe dispenses pain indiscriminately, with no regard for merit or justice. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is fundamentally simple. The world does not operate on a system of moral accounting. Suffering is distributed by the arbitrary mechanics of genetics, geography, timing, and chance, rather than by any proportional response to actions taken or character demonstrated. A child cannot choose their parents, their birthplace, or the economic circumstances into which they emerge. A person cannot control the cellular mutations that lead to disease, nor the random encounters that lead to trauma. Yet we persist in a collective delusion that the world is fundamentally fair, that good things happen to good people and misfortune falls upon those who deserve it. This belief comforts us because it suggests we maintain control, that our suffering would be earned and our safety guaranteed by virtue. We have normalized this denial so completely that we rarely acknowledge the staggering number of innocent people enduring undeserved agony at any given moment. And we certainly do not build our systems of justice, medicine, and social support around the obvious truth that random suffering requires compassion rather than judgment. Consider the fundamental architecture of human consciousness and how we navigate existence. Every meaning you have ever assigned to anything, every value system you have ever internalized, every purpose you have ever pursued with genuine conviction was ultimately constructed by you or inherited from others without your explicit consent to scrutinize it. There is no inherent meaning embedded in the universe waiting to be discovered like buried treasure. A career is not intrinsically meaningful until you decide it is. A relationship holds no predetermined significance until you invest emotional weight into it. Success itself is a concept entirely dependent on whatever parameters you or your culture have agreed to measure it by, and yet we live our entire lives as though these meanings were objective facts rather than elaborate fictions we have collectively agreed to maintain. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon is remarkably efficient. Our brains are pattern-seeking and meaning-making organs that evolved to find purpose and structure in chaos because doing so increased our survival odds in ancestral environments. We cannot function without meaning, so we generate it automatically, and once generated, we forget that we generated it and begin treating our self-constructed meanings as though they were discovered truths handed down from the heavens themselves. This allows us to move through the world with confidence and conviction rather than paralysis, but it also means that the entire scaffolding upon which we build our lives rests on nothing more solid than collective agreement and personal choice. What persists despite this underlying emptiness is our unwillingness to acknowledge it directly in our daily lives. We have normalized the practice of behaving as though our meanings were external and immutable, speaking about purpose as though it were something to be found rather than created, and we rarely pause to confront. We construct elaborate narratives around our lives, telling ourselves that we are on a meaningful journey towards some predetermined destination, that our suffering serves a greater purpose, that the choices we make are leading us somewhere intentional and significant, when in reality we are largely products of circumstance, chance, and the accumulated weight of decisions made by people long before we were born. The human mind appears neurologically incapable of accepting randomness and meaninglessness, so it automatically generates storylines to make sense of experience, transforming mundane sequences of events into quest narratives complete with obstacles to overcome, lessons to learn, and hidden meaning waiting to be discovered. We tell ourselves that our failed relationships were necessary for personal growth, that our career setbacks were redirecting us toward our true calling, that our childhood trauma was actually preparation for our life's work, when the simpler truth is that these things happened, and we survived them, and now we continue existing. This psychological mechanism likely evolved because believing in personal narrative and purpose increases motivation and reduces despair, making purposeful fiction neurologically advantageous even when logically unsound. We perpetuate these stories despite abundant evidence that life is largely indifferent to our narrative arc, that most people never discover their singular purpose, that many live perfectly adequate lives without ever feeling that their existence pointed toward anything particular or meaningful. Yet we have so thoroughly normalized this practice of meaning-making that questioning whether your life has purpose is considered psychologically concerning rather than philosophically honest. And we continue spinning these personal fictions into adulthood, bedtime stories we tell ourselves to make the randomness feel directed and the emptiness feel full. Consider the historical figure you learned about in school, the one whose name appeared in textbooks and whose achievements seemed monumental enough to echo through the centuries. Yet today you struggle to recall even the basic details of their life or contributions. And this pattern repeats across nearly every domain of human endeavor, where we spend our entire existence constructing monuments to ourselves, building businesses that outlive us, writing books we believe will be remembered. Creating art we imagine will inspire generations, only to watch as the years compress these grand gestures into footnotes, then into obscure references, and eventually into complete erasure from collective memory. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is straightforward and somewhat brutal in its logic. Human attention is finite, the volume of information and achievement continuously expands, and each new generation arrives with their own heroes to elevate and their own legacy to build, which naturally displaces the previous generation's carefully curated monuments into the background noise of history. We understand intellectually that even the most celebrated figures of our time will become increasingly irrelevant to people born just 50 years from now, that the corporations we believe are permanent institutions will either dissolve or transform beyond recognition, that the books we read and treasure will gather dust in digital vaults, accessible but forgotten, and yet we persist in our legacy-building behaviors as though they matter eternally. As though the work we do and the name we make will somehow transcend the natural law of cultural entropy and remain vivid in people's minds long after we have died. Perhaps this persistence itself is the point, not that legacy endures, but that the act of creation and striving gives shape and meaning to our finite time, regardless of whether anyone remembers it afterward. Consider the trajectory of human ambition and how it inevitably collides with the indifference of time itself. You work toward a goal for years, perhaps decades, investing your energy, sacrifice, and hope into accomplishing something meaningful. The day arrives when you finally achieve it, when you cross that finish line you have been staring at for so long, and in that moment there is a brief flash of satisfaction that quickly dissolves into something far more unsettling than disappointment. The achievement that once seemed to define your worth, that you believed would transform your life and cement your place in the world, becomes simply another fact about your past, something that gradually fades from relevance as new days demand your attention and new challenges surface to replace it. This pattern repeats throughout life with remarkable consistency. The promotion you fought for becomes your baseline within weeks. The degree you earned sits unused on your wall while you struggle with problems it never prepared you for. The award, the record, the milestone that once felt monumental becomes background noise in the ongoing narrative of existence. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon is rooted in hedonic adaptation, the brain's remarkable ability to normalize achievement and return to a baseline emotional state regardless of external accomplishment. Yet there is something deeper at work here, something more philosophically unsettling than mere neurochemistry. Achievements become irrelevant because they are fundamentally frozen moments in a constantly moving present. The future always matters more than the past, and the moment you complete something, you have already moved beyond it into the next phase of existence where your previous accomplishments carry no weight whatsoever. You work toward something for months or years, visualizing the moment of completion, imagining how satisfied you will feel when the finish line arrives, and then you reach it. You achieve what you set out to do. The goal is accomplished, and in that moment there is often nothing. The sense of fulfillment you anticipated simply does not materialize. Instead, there is a strange emptiness, a quiet anticlimax that settles over the achievement like dust. You may feel a brief flutter of relief or a momentary sense of validation, but the deep, sustaining joy you expected to feel is absent. Within days, or sometimes within hours, the accomplishment begins to fade into your past as though it were always meant to be forgettable, and your mind has already shifted its focus to the next thing you should be doing, the next mountain you should be climbing. This phenomenon occurs because our brains are fundamentally oriented toward anticipation and desire rather than toward satisfaction and contentment. The reward pathway in our neurology is activated most intensely during the pursuit of a goal, when hope and uncertainty exist in equal measure. Once certainty arrives, once the outcome is determined and the goal is secured, the neurochemical reward system quiets down substantially. We are biochemically wired to enjoy the chase far more than the capture, and this creates a trap where we condition ourselves to believe that fulfillment lies always in what comes next, not in what we have already obtained. We have normalized this hollow feeling so completely that we rarely question it or consider it unusual. Instead, we simply accept that accomplishments are meant to be temporary markers on an endless path, forgettable waypoints on a journey that has no ultimate destination. We tell ourselves this is just how life works, how ambition functions, how growth occurs. Consider the moment when you achieve something you have worked toward for months, a goal that once seemed distant and impossible, yet you reach it and feel the satisfaction bloom within you, only to have it wither almost instantly when you scroll through your phone and see someone else who achieved the same thing faster or achieved something greater, and suddenly your accomplishment feels small and insignificant in comparison. This is the mechanism of comparison at work, a psychological phenomenon so deeply embedded in human nature that we rarely question its presence or its cost to our well-being. The human mind evolved in small communities where relative status mattered for survival, where knowing your position within a group hierarchy determined access to resources and mates. But that ancient wiring has been hijacked by a modern world that offers infinite comparisons across infinite populations. When you compare yourself to the handful of people in your immediate social circle, the bandwidth of comparison is limited and manageable. But now you can compare yourself to millions of people across the globe at any moment, and your brain treats these digital strangers as real competitors in your life, flooding your system with the same stress hormones it would produce if you were actually losing status in your tribe. The insidious aspect of comparison is that it requires no logical foundation to damage your joy, because joy is not a fixed quantity determined by objective achievement, but rather a relative state determined largely by your psychological reference point. And when you constantly shift that reference point upward by comparing yourself to those ahead of you, your own progress becomes invisible to your emotional experience. We have normalized this behavior so completely that we barely notice it happening, accepting it as natural human tendency rather than recognizing it as a specific cognitive trap that has been amplified and weaponed. Consider the student who refuses to begin writing their essay until they have found the perfect opening sentence, the one that will capture their thesis with absolute precision and elegance, and so they sit in front of a blank page for hours, days sometimes, unable to move forward because no attempt seems adequate enough, each draft abandoned before completion because it fails to meet some invisible standard of excellence that exists only in their mind. Consider the professional who delays launching their business, their creative project, their career pivot, perpetually convinced that they need just a little more preparation, one more certification, one more round of planning before they can step into the world and risk exposure to judgment. Consider the relationship that never begins because both people are waiting for the moment when they feel completely certain, when all doubt dissolves and they can approach one another with the confidence of perfection, and so years pass in the space between longing and inaction. The mechanism here is quietly devastating because it masquerades as conscientiousness, as a desire for quality and excellence, when in truth it is often rooted in fear disguised as standards. The human brain, when faced with the possibility of failure or criticism, will sometimes generate an impossible checklist of conditions that must be met before action becomes permissible. And since perfection is, by definition, unattainable, this checklist becomes infinite, a trap disguised as ambition. What makes this pattern so insidious is that we have constructed entire systems that reinforce it, educational institutions that reward flawless work and punish mistakes, professional environments where a single error can damage reputation, social media spaces where only the most curated versions of life receive validation. Consider the simple act of shaking hands when you meet someone, a gesture so ingrained in professional and social contexts that most people perform it without thinking. Yet there is nothing inherently meaningful about gripping another person's hand for a few seconds, and in many parts of the world, this exact same gesture means something entirely different or nothing at all. And yet we have collectively decided that this particular motion signifies respect, agreement, and trustworthiness. The deeper you examine any standard or norm that governs human behavior, the more you realize that almost none of them exist because they are objectively correct or logically necessary, but rather because at some point in history, someone decided something should be done a certain way, enough people agreed or were forced to comply, and then that arbitrary choice calcified into tradition and eventually into something that feels natural and inevitable. Think about the clothes we wear, the foods we consider acceptable to eat, the times we wake and sleep, the way we arrange our furniture, or the specific words we use as greetings. None of these things have cosmic significance or logical underpinning. They are simply collective agreements that have become so normalized we forget they are agreements at all. What makes this genuinely unsettling is the psychological mechanism that allows arbitrary standards to gain power over us. Once a standard is established and widely followed, our brains begin to perceive deviations from it as wrong or offensive, even when we intellectually understand the standard itself was arbitrary to begin with. We develop genuine emotional responses to arbitrary constructs, feeling genuine shame when we violate them, genuine anger when others do, and this emotional investment makes the arbitrary feel like natural law. Consider the life you believe you are supposed to be living, the timeline you were told to follow, the metrics by which you measure whether you are on track or falling behind, and understand that every single one of these benchmarks is entirely fictional. You were taught that normal meant finishing school by a certain age, entering the workforce in your early 20s, finding a partner by 30, purchasing a home, raising children in a particular way, and retiring at 65, yet when you examine the actual lives of people around you, you discover that almost no one follows this path in any consistent manner. Some people never marry, some never have children, some change careers 5 times, some never own homes, some retire early, some work until they die, some pursue unconventional relationships, some struggle with mental health, some achieve success through non-traditional means, and yet we continue to speak of normal as though it is a real thing that exists somewhere, a destination that most people reach while acknowledging that we ourselves feel perpetually outside of it. The mechanism behind this persistent fiction is that normal serves a function for those in power. It provides a standardized expectation that allows institutions to measure, categorize, and manage populations more efficiently. When everyone is attempting to reach the same predetermined milestones, they become predictable and controllable. Schools teach normal, corporations reinforce normal, media advertises normal, and social structures reward normal, all while the actual data reveals that the bell curve is so wide and so varied that normal encompasses almost nothing at all. What makes this particularly disturbing is that we have normalized the feeling of abnormality. Most people feel like they are not normal, like they are falling short, like something is wrong with them, even though this feeling is so universal that it might actually be the only normal thing. What we call sanity is not an objective measure of mental health, but rather a culturally constructed agreement about what thoughts and behaviors fall within acceptable bounds, which means that a person considered deeply sane in one society might be labeled mentally ill in another. Their identical thoughts and actions simply recontextualized through different cultural lenses and value systems. Consider the person who hears voices claiming divine messages. In contemporary Western medicine, this is often a symptom of schizophrenia requiring intervention, yet in many traditional societies, such individuals are recognized as shamans or spiritual leaders whose unique perceptual abilities are valued and cultivated rather than medicated away. The mechanism driving this is that sanity functions as a social consensus rather than a medical absolute. a reflection of what a particular culture has decided is normal, rational, and acceptable. And this consensus shifts with historical periods, religious movements, economic systems, and geographic locations, revealing that our definition of a sound mind is fundamentally about conformity to local expectations rather than any universal standard of psychological health. We have created elaborate diagnostic manuals and psychiatric frameworks that present sanity as scientifically objective. Yet these documents are revised every few decades as cultural values change. Conditions are added and removed from official lists, not because our neuroscience suddenly evolved, but because cultural attitudes shifted, and we are now comfortable calling normal what we once pathologized or pathologizing what we once accepted. The person who questions authority structures might be seen as dangerously unstable in an authoritarian regime, but applauded as critically thinking in a democratic society. Yet their neurological function remains identical, only the cultural interpretation of their behavior transforms. Throughout history, there exists a peculiar phenomenon where individuals experiencing mental breakdown, psychosis, or the dissolution of conventional thought patterns suddenly articulate truths about reality that the so-called sane majority has systematically ignored or rationalized away. A person in acute psychological distress might strip away the comfortable narratives we construct about meaning, purpose, and social obligation, instead perceiving the arbitrary nature of human existence with startling precision. They see through the elaborate systems we've built to distract ourselves from mortality and meaninglessness, recognizing how our jobs, social hierarchies, and consumer behaviors function as sophisticated denial mechanisms rather than genuine sources of fulfillment. The mechanism behind this phenomenon operates through what we might call the destruction of cognitive scaffolding. The mind, when fractured from its normal operating parameters, loses the ability to maintain the protective illusions that keep most people functional. Without the neurological filters that edit reality into palatable narratives, the raw input of existence becomes visible in its undecorated form. A person having a breakdown might perceive how absurd it is that we spend decades accumulating possessions that will outlive us, or how futile it is to pursue recognition in a universe indifferent to human achievement. Yet society has developed mechanisms to dismiss these insights as mere symptoms of disease, pathologizing the clarity itself rather than examining whether the clarity might contain legitimate observations. We treat the message and the messenger as inseparable, assuming that because the person is experiencing neurochemical disruption, their perceptions must be entirely unreliable. Consider the fundamental uncertainty that governs your biological existence. You can do everything right and still develop cancer. You can exercise daily and suffer a massive stroke at 45. You can eat perfectly and be struck by a genetic disease that was dormant in your family line for generations, waiting to express itself at precisely the moment your cells divide in just the wrong way. This is the uncomfortable reality that contradicts the narrative we have constructed around health and wellness, the pervasive belief that our bodies are machines we can control through discipline and correct choices. The truth is far more unsettling. Genetics load the dice before you are even born, determining your predisposition to heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, and countless other conditions that will eventually find expression regardless of your lifestyle choices. Environmental factors beyond your control, the air quality of the neighborhood where you happen to live, the water supply in your region, the pathogens that circulate through your community, the stress levels imposed by circumstances of birth and circumstance, play roles equally or more significant than your personal habits. You might inherit robust genes and live recklessly into old age, while someone else practices perfect discipline and collapses at 50. The wellness industry has built an empire on the premise that health is merit-based, that sickness is largely a failure of willpower and attention, that if you just purchase the right supplements, follow the right protocols, maintain the right mindset, you can ensure your survival and vitality. This narrative is psychologically comforting because it offers the illusion of control, the sense that your fate lies in your hands, that you are the architect of your own well-being. There exists a profound and inescapable reality that we spend our entire lives trying to ignore or postpone through various means of maintenance and care. And that reality is the simple fact that the physical vessel we inhabit will inevitably decline, weaken, and ultimately fail us at some point, no matter what preventative measures we undertake or how diligently we attempt to preserve it. When we are young, our bodies seem almost invincible, responding to our commands with precision and speed, healing quickly from injuries, recovering rapidly from exhaustion, and generally cooperating with our ambitions and desires without complaint or hesitation. Yet somewhere in the progression of our lives, sometimes gradually and sometimes shockingly abruptly, this partnership between mind and body begins to deteriorate in ways both obvious and subtle, with joints that once bent freely starting to creak and ache, with energy that once seemed limitless diminishing day by day, with reflexes slowing and eyesight dimming and hearing fading into a narrowing bandwidth of sound. The biological reality underlying this betrayal is the relentless process of cellular degradation and accumulated damage that occurs at the microscopic level throughout our entire existence, where telomeres shorten with each cell division, where proteins misfold and accumulate, where the systems that repair and replace damaged tissues gradually lose their efficiency and capacity. We respond to this inevitable decline by investing enormous amounts of money, time, and mental energy into fighting against it through exercise programs and dietary restrictions and medical interventions and cosmetic procedures. Yet despite these efforts, the body continues its slow march toward dysfunction and failure, indifferent to our resistance and our denial. Consider the trajectory of cognitive decline that occurs across the human lifespan with such reliable consistency that neuroscientists can predict with remarkable accuracy when and how your mental faculties will begin to fade. Starting in your late 20s, your brain begins a slow process of cellular loss and connection degradation that continues relentlessly throughout your remaining years, a biological countdown that affects memory first, then processing speed, then the ability to learn new information with the same fluidity you once possessed. This deterioration follows patterns so predictable that researchers can map the decline across different cognitive domains, knowing that fluid intelligence will diminish faster than crystallized knowledge, that attention span will narrow, that the retrieval of specific facts will grow harder even as general wisdom might increase. The mechanism underlying this decline involves the progressive loss of neurons, the thinning of gray matter, the weakening of synaptic connections that have formed the physical substrate of everything you know and everything you are. Processes driven by oxidative stress, inflammation, and the simple accumulation of cellular damage that your body becomes less efficient at repairing with each passing year. What makes this particularly unsettling is the predictability of it all, the fact that neuroscience has essentially created a formula for your cognitive decline, understanding the variables and rates of decay so thoroughly that they can chart your mental trajectory decades in advance. We have largely normalized this fate by framing it as natural aging, by accepting that cognitive decline is simply the price of living long enough to accumulate years, by treating it as an inevitable feature of existence rather than the gradual dissolution of self that it fundamentally represents. You move through the world trusting what you see, hear, smell, taste, and feel, yet every single moment your senses are actively lying to you in ways both profound and mundane. Your eyes, for instance, do not see a continuous, clear image of the world around you, but rather your brain constructs a narrative of vision by filling in enormous blind spots that exist in your visual field, gaps so significant that they would render you effectively blind if you were aware of them. Yet you never notice because your consciousness simply invents detail where none exists. When you look at a person's face, you believe you are seeing their entire face clearly, but your eyes can only focus sharply on a tiny area roughly the size of your thumbnail at arm's length, and everything in your peripheral vision is blurry and incomplete, yet your brain manufactures the illusion of perfect clarity across your entire visual field. Your ears engage in similar deception, compressing and editing the soundscape around you, amplifying certain frequencies while suppressing others based on what your brain has learned to deem important, so that two people standing in the same room literally hear different sounds, different compositions of the acoustic environment, despite believing they experience identical auditory realities. Touch deceives you with temperature illusions, with the famous example being how your hand placed on cool water followed by warm water will feel the temperature as entirely different based on which hand experienced it first, even though the water itself has not changed. Taste and smell work almost entirely through memory and expectation, which is why food tastes flavorless when you have a cold, why you can no longer smell your own home despite living there for years, why the same coffee tastes bitter on Monday but pleasant on Friday, the substance unchanged but your sensory apparatus completely recontextualized by your mind. Consider the profound truth that the world you experience is not the world as it objectively exists, but rather a filtered, interpreted version constructed entirely by your nervous system and mind. Every moment of your conscious experience is built from fragments, light waves converted to electrical signals in your retina, sound waves transformed into neurochemical cascades, tactile sensations processed through layers of neural interpretation. Your brain does not receive reality whole and intact. It receives raw data and then assembles something from that data, filling in gaps, making assumptions, and coloring everything with your personal history, beliefs, and expectations. Two people standing in the same room literally inhabit different worlds, each constructed from their own perceptual filters and cognitive interpretations. What you call seeing is actually a sophisticated hallucination your brain generates based on incomplete sensory information, and this hallucination is so convincing that you mistake it for direct perception of objective reality. The mechanisms behind this are deeply embedded in how consciousness works. Your brain must selectively attend to stimuli, prioritize information based on relevance to your survival and goals, and integrate current perception with memory and prediction. The disturbing part is that you cannot escape this construction. You cannot step outside your own mind to verify that your reality matches anyone else's or the true external world. You are forever trapped inside your own phenomenological bubble, and yet you navigate the world with such confidence, convinced that what you see and feel is what actually is. This fundamental solipsism of human experience persists despite our intellectual understanding that it is true, and we have normalized it to the point where we rarely acknowledge that every single human being lives in a universe constructed entirely within their own skull, separate fro. Consider the simple act of describing what happened during a conversation between two people, or what caused a particular historical event, or even what the weather was like on a specific day last month. You might think that reality itself is objective, and that truth about these events should be verifiable and absolute, yet when you examine this assumption closely, you discover something unsettling. No matter how carefully you document, observe, or measure, your access to objective truth remains fundamentally compromised by the very nature of perception and language. Every observation you make is filtered through your sensory apparatus, which has built-in limitations and biases shaped by evolution and individual experience. Your brain does not passively receive reality like a camera recording a scene. Instead, it actively constructs reality by selecting which information to process, which details to emphasize, and which to discard entirely. When you describe what you witnessed, you must translate the raw sensory experience into language, and language itself is an imperfect tool that compresses infinite complexity into discrete symbols and structures. The words available to you carry historical baggage, cultural assumptions, and limitations that inevitably distort the original experience. Two observers of the identical event will produce different accounts not because one is lying, but because their sensory filters, their linguistic choices, and their interpretive frameworks are inherently different. This problem compounds across time, across people, and across disciplines. Scientists can measure phenomena with remarkable precision, yet even the most rigorous measurements depend on the instruments used, which themselves have limitations and require interpretation. The very act of measuring something changes it, as quantum mechanics discovered decades ago. Consider a single photograph of a crowd at a public event, and watch how dozens of people will describe it in fundamentally different ways based on their beliefs, experiences, and emotional states. One observer sees a peaceful gathering of like-minded individuals, while another sees manipulation and groupthink. A third sees economic opportunity, a fourth sees environmental destruction from the gathering itself. The photograph remains unchanged, yet the facts it contains have fractured into multiple incompatible realities. This phenomenon extends far beyond visual interpretation into the realm of pure information, where identical data sets become different truths depending on who is processing them. A statistic about employment can simultaneously represent economic success and economic failure depending on which subset of the population you choose to examine, which time period you select as your baseline, and what you decide to define as employment itself. Scientists interpreting the same experimental results in peer review sometimes reach contradictory conclusions about what the data actually demonstrates, not because they are dishonest, but because facts exist within frameworks of interpretation that are themselves products of prior assumptions. The unsettling truth is that our brains are not objective recording devices that passively absorb reality. Instead, they are pattern-matching systems that actively construct meaning from information, filtering everything through the lens of what we already believe to be true. When presented with ambiguous information, we unconsciously select the interpretation that best aligns with our existing worldview, and this process happens automatically, beneath the level of conscious awareness. We have normalized this fundamental subjectivity so completely that we pretend facts are objective while simultaneously arguing endlessly about what they mean. The events of the past exist in a fixed temporal reality that we can never revisit or verify directly, yet somehow the narratives surrounding these events shift and transform with remarkable consistency across generations, regions, and political systems. What was taught in schools as historical fact during one era becomes recognized as propaganda or distortion in another, and the textbooks are revised, the monuments are toppled or erected anew, and the official stories are reframed to align with contemporary values and power structures. This phenomenon occurs not through any grand conspiracy, but through the natural human tendency to interpret past events through the lens of present concerns, present moralities, and present political needs. Historians and scholars work from incomplete sources, fragmented records, and accounts written by those with their own biases and agendas, which means that every historical narrative is already a construction, a selection, a story told about what happened rather than what happened itself. As societies gain new information, as previously silenced voices finally find platforms, as political winds shift and different groups gain influence over educational institutions and cultural narratives, the stories we tell about our past necessarily change. What once seemed like settled truth becomes complicated, becomes contested, becomes reframed in ways that would have seemed impossible to previous generations. We are taught in childhood that history is factual and objective, that it represents what actually occurred, yet we simultaneously experience it being revised repeatedly throughout our lives, and somehow we do not find this fundamentally unsettling. We accept that the way our nation or culture is represented in historical accounts will shift based on who is currently writing or curating those accounts, that triumphant narratives can become shameful ones, that heroes can be revealed as villains or vice. Consider the strange temporal architecture of your own consciousness. By the time you become aware that something is happening right now, it has already happened. The present moment you experience is never truly present at all, but rather a carefully reconstructed memory of the immediate past that your brain has already processed and delivered to your awareness with a slight but inevitable delay. Neuroscientists have measured this lag, finding that your conscious experience of events occurs roughly 200 to 500 milliseconds after the actual neural activity that corresponds to those events. This means that every single moment you believe you are living is technically a ghost, a representation of something that has already ceased to exist by the time you perceive it. You are perpetually chasing a present that has already vanished before you can grasp it. Your sense of now is an illusion crafted by your brain to create coherence and continuity, to make the fragmented and delayed stream of sensory information feel like a unified, flowing present moment. The brain essentially predicts what should be happening based on previous patterns and fills in the gaps with constructed experience, creating the false sensation that you are directly perceiving reality as it unfolds. Yet we live our entire lives as though the present moment is real and tangible, making decisions based on what we believe is happening right now, speaking words we think we are choosing in real time, moving through space with the conviction that we are acting in the present. We have built entire systems of meaning around this fictional now. Tense systems in language, legal accountability based on intentions at a specific moment, relationships founded on the assumption that we can truly meet another person in a shared present. Consider the peculiar nature of temporal experience. You wake up today, and today becomes now, becomes then, becomes yesterday, and tomorrow perpetually recedes into the future like a horizon that moves away as you approach it. Tomorrow exists only as a concept, as a promise written in your mind, yet the moment it arrives, it transforms into today, into the present moment where all your actual living occurs, and then it too slips away into the past. This means that tomorrow, in its pure form as the thing you imagine and plan for, never truly arrives at all. Instead, it ceases to exist the moment it becomes accessible to you. You spend your entire life reaching towards something that cannot be grasped in the way you imagine it, always experiencing only the now, never the tomorrow. The mechanism behind this phenomenon lies in how your consciousness processes time. Tomorrow is a mental construct used to organize future intentions and fears, but consciousness itself only ever operates in the present moment where sensory data becomes experience. Your brain creates the illusion of continuity across these moments, but subjectively, you are always living in a razor-thin slice of now, watching an infinite corridor of future possibilities collapse into the actuality of the present moment, then dissolve into memory. What makes this particularly disorienting is that despite knowing this intellectually, despite understanding that tomorrow cannot be experienced in advance, humans continue to structure their entire existence around reaching toward it, sacrificing the present moment for a state of being that vanishes the moment it arrives, and we accept this fundamental impossibility as simply the way life works. Never quite questioning why we remain so invested in chasing something that by its very nature cannot be caught. Consider the span of a human life measured against the age of the universe, and you will discover a mathematical reality so profound that most people instinctively reject it the moment they truly understand it. A person who lives to be 100 years old experiences roughly 36,500 days of consciousness, which sounds substantial until you calculate it against the 14 billion years the universe has existed, rendering your entire existence equivalent to a single grain of sand on an incomprehensibly vast beach that stretches beyond comprehension. This is not metaphor or poetic exaggeration, but rather a straightforward mathematical observation that becomes more disturbing the longer you sit with it. Within this already infinitesimal span, the portion of your life that you will actually remember, that will feel vivid and present and real, comprises perhaps only a few thousand moments scattered across those decades, because most days blur together into an undifferentiated haze of routine and repetition. The psychological mechanism at work here involves what neuroscientists call the paradox of subjective time, wherein moments that feel stretched and eternal while you are experiencing them compress into nothing when recalled, and years that seem to stretch ahead of you during childhood now pass in what feels like months. We have normalized this bizarre compression by referring to it casually as time flying or describing how quickly children grow up, treating it as a gentle observation rather than as the genuinely horrifying temporal dissolution it represents. The strange comfort we derive from this normalization persists despite having absolutely no logical foundation, because to truly confront the accelerating brevity of existence would require us to fundamentally reorganize how we spend our hours and what we consider meaningful, and most people would rather maintain the gentle fiction that there is always M. Consider the experience of living through any given day, where you move from one moment to the next in what feels like a continuous present, yet each instant vanishes the moment it arrives, leaving behind only a fragmentary memory that degrades further with each passing hour. You experience breakfast, and within seconds that sensory reality, the taste of coffee, the texture of toast, the light coming through the window, ceases to exist as a lived present moment and becomes instead a fading mental impression that you cannot fully reconstruct. The moment itself does not linger or persist in any accessible way. It simply disappears into the past, converted into memory, which is a fundamentally different thing than the original experience. This happens constantly, relentlessly, thousands of times per day with every conversation you have, every view you encounter, every sensation that moves across your consciousness. Your brain is structured in such a way that it cannot hold the present moment in a static state. The very act of experiencing something immediately transforms it into memory, and memory is inherently unreliable, selective, and subject to degradation and distortion. Neuroscience tells us that consciousness operates through a continuous flow of neural activity that creates the illusion of a stable now, but in reality, there is a measurable delay between what happens in the external world and what your brain registers as the present moment. By the time you become aware of something, it has already begun to pass away. What is remarkable is how thoroughly we have normalized this fundamental instability of experience, how we move through life as though we are living in a stable, coherent present, when in fact we are always already in the past, always already losing what we think we have. Consider the moment you finish something you have waited for your entire life, something you have rehearsed in your mind 1,000 times, something that was supposed to change everything about how you feel. Perhaps it is a graduation, a wedding day, the birth of a child, or standing at the summit of a mountain you spent years training to climb. In the actual moment of experiencing it, there is often a peculiar hollowness, a sense of unreality, as though you are watching yourself from outside your body rather than truly inhabiting the experience itself. And then within hours or sometimes mere minutes, the vividness begins to deteriorate, the colors fade, the sounds become muffled in memory. The precise feeling of the moment slips away like water through your fingers, leaving behind only a faint outline of what was supposedly so momentous. What remains is not the experience itself, but rather your memory of having had an experience, which is fundamentally different and far less rich. This happens because human consciousness possesses an inherent adaptation mechanism. Your nervous system becomes desensitized to stimuli almost immediately, a process called hedonic adaptation that evolved to keep your brain alert for novelty and danger rather than basking in contentment. The intense emotion you expected to sustain simply cannot be sustained because your mind prioritizes information processing over the preservation of feeling. More troubling still is how rarely we acknowledge this phenomenon despite its universal occurrence. We continue to pursue these peak moments as though they will somehow be different the next time, as though the next achievement or acquisition or experience will finally deliver the lasting fulfillment we seek. We take photographs and videos obsessively, as though recording the moment externally might somehow prevent its internal dissolution. Yet the images themselves often feel like they are showing us someone else's. There exists a peculiar contradiction at the heart of human connection that we rarely acknowledge in its full weight. We are taught that love should be effortless and natural, yet every meaningful relationship in existence demands constant, deliberate work to survive. Consider the reality of any long-term partnership, whether romantic, familial, or deeply platonic. In the beginning, the relationship sustains itself through novelty and chemical attraction, through the sheer gravitational pull of discovering another person. But as weeks turn into months and months into years, that initial momentum dissipates, and what remains requires active maintenance in the form of communication, emotional labor, compromise, and the continuous choice to remain present. Without this maintenance, relationships do not simply plateau at their current level of intimacy, they actively deteriorate. They accumulate resentment like rust accumulates on metal. Small grievances that were never addressed calcify into larger wounds. The psychological explanation is straightforward. Humans are creatures of habit and comfort, and when we stop actively engaging with our partners, we begin to relate to them as we relate to furniture or walls, as familiar fixtures rather than living, changing people who possess their own needs and internal worlds. Yet we have normalized this requirement so thoroughly that we speak of relationships as requiring work only in whispered tones, as if admitting this fundamental truth somehow diminishes their value or authenticity. We have built an entire cultural narrative around the idea that true love should require no effort, that soulmates simply understand each other without discussion, that passion should sustain connection indefinitely. When two people commit to each other, they are making an implicit agreement that their own desires, ambitions, and freedoms will be subordinated to the needs of the relationship. And this is presented to us as not only normal, but as the ultimate expression of devotion and care, yet it reveals something deeply unsettling about how we understand human connection and personal autonomy. A person might abandon a career opportunity because their partner cannot relocate, or they might suppress their own interests and friendships to accommodate their spouse's preferences, or they might spend decades attending to emotional needs that drain them completely, all while being told this is what love looks like, that this is the price of genuine intimacy. The mechanism at work here is rooted in our evolutionary past and our deep neurological need for belonging and pair bonding, which creates a chemical reward system that makes sacrifice feel meaningful rather than coercive. And simultaneously, we have built entire cultural and religious frameworks around the glorification of selflessness in romantic relationships, so that questioning whether we should surrender our autonomy feels like questioning whether we should love at all. What persists despite the logical inconsistency is the normalization of a fundamentally transactional arrangement dressed up in the language of unconditional emotion, where we are told that real love means putting someone else's well-being consistently above our own boundaries and development. Yet we rarely acknowledge that healthy relationships require both partners to maintain their sense of self, their ambitions, and their individual happiness. And that sacrifice made resentfully or under the weight of expectation ultimately corrodes the very connection it was meant to strengthen, creating a quiet desperation that becomes indistinguishable from genuine care. Consider the fundamental paradox of human intimacy. The only way to truly connect with another person is to expose the parts of yourself that you most want to hide, yet this exposure is the very thing we spend most of our lives defending against. When you meet someone you might grow close to, The pathway toward meaningful connection demands that you gradually remove your protective layers, share your fears and failures, admit your uncertainties and insecurities, and reveal the aspects of yourself that don't fit neatly into the image you present to the world. This vulnerability is not merely helpful in building connection, it is absolutely essential to it. Research in psychology and neuroscience consistently demonstrates that people feel closest to others precisely when they believe they are truly known, accepted, and valued despite their imperfections. Yet this requirement places us in an extraordinarily uncomfortable position because vulnerability carries genuine risk. When you expose your true self to another person, you grant them the power to reject you, to judge you, to use your confessions against you, or to simply withdraw their affection upon discovering who you really are. The mechanism behind this is simple. Authentic connection cannot exist between people who are performing curated versions of themselves, because a connection built on performance is fundamentally a connection with a fiction rather than with a real human being. We have normalized the pursuit of shallow relationships and surface-level interactions because they feel safer, because they allow us to maintain control, and because they protect us from the unbearable prospect of being truly seen and found lacking. Yet simultaneously, we feel profoundly lonely, disconnected, and misunderstood, seemingly unable to recognize that our desperate need to appear whole and complete is precisely what prevents us from experiencing the genuine acceptance and belonging. The longer two people share a life together, the more they see of each other's true nature, and paradoxically, this closeness often transforms affection into indifference or mild disdain. A couple that once felt electrified by each other's presence now occupies the same space with barely a glance, their conversations reduced to logistics about bills and schedules. The partner who once seemed endlessly fascinating becomes predictable, their mannerisms that once charmed now irritate, their vulnerabilities that once inspired tenderness now feel like weakness or burden. This phenomenon is not born from any grand betrayal or dramatic falling out, but rather from the simple accumulation of familiarity, the erosion that comes from knowing someone too completely. When you have seen your partner at their absolute worst, when you know exactly how they will react to disappointment or stress, when you have witnessed their bathroom habits and heard their most mundane thoughts, the mystery dissolves entirely. The psychological mechanism at work is exposure habituation, where repeated exposure to stimulus causes our emotional response to diminish, and combined with the reality that no human being can sustain performance indefinitely, the idealized version we initially loved inevitably crumbles. We normalize this trajectory as simply what happens to love over time, accepting that passion fades and romance dies, that this cold familiarity is merely the price of committed partnership. Yet we persist in seeking these intimate bonds despite knowing their likely destination, building relationships with the implicit understanding that warmth will likely curdle into cool tolerance, that the person we choose to share our life with will eventually become someone we tolerate rather than adore. Think about the first time you fell in love with someone, or the first time you visited a place that took your breath away, or the first time you heard a song that seemed to speak directly to your soul. There was something ineffable about those moments, something that felt almost sacred in its strangeness and newness. The person across from you seemed to contain infinite depths, their mannerisms both predictable and surprising in equal measure. The landscape held secrets in its every corner. The melody seemed to contain truths you couldn't quite articulate, but then time passed, and something fundamental shifted without you necessarily noticing. You learned their habits, their patterns, their favorite phrases, and the exact way they react to disappointment. You walked the same streets enough times that they became mere backdrop rather than destination. You heard the song so many times that it became wallpaper, pleasant but unremarkable. The mystery didn't disappear violently, it simply dissolved like sugar in water, and what remained was something far more ordinary. This is the mechanism of familiarity, and it operates with ruthless efficiency across every domain of human experience. Our brains are designed to move from conscious attention to unconscious automation, to take the extraordinary and render it mundane through repetition. Mystery requires novelty, surprise, the sense that something contains more than what we currently understand. But familiarity is the antidote to mystery because it fills in the gaps, it removes uncertainty, it transforms the unknown into the known. We come to believe we understand a person completely, that we have mapped the territory of their personality, when in reality we have only learned the most obvious landmarks. We feel we have mastered a place, understood it fully, yet there are infinite dimensions we never explore. Consider the architecture of your daily experience. You wake to notifications from applications you installed specifically to receive them. You scroll through feeds engineered to show you content you have never seen before. You purchase items designed to feel fresh and different from the versions you bought last month. And you consume entertainment in formats that promise to revolutionize storytelling, but largely recycled familiar narratives with surface-level variations. This is novelty addiction in the modern world, and it operates so seamlessly within the infrastructure of contemporary life that most people never recognize it as a compulsion at all. The human brain evolved to respond to new stimuli because novelty once signaled survival-relevant information, a new animal in the territory, a different food source, an unfamiliar threat. That ancient reward system, designed to keep our ancestors alert and adaptive, has been hijacked by technologies and consumer systems that generate infinite streams of the ostensibly new without ever providing genuine substantive difference. Social media algorithms learned long ago that the dopamine response to novelty could be triggered reliably and repeatedly, so they optimized their systems to serve you an unending parade of minor variations on content you have already consumed countless times. You feel compelled to check your notifications not because you expect something truly novel, but because the possibility of novelty, however slim, activates the same neural pathways that once warned of predators. Fashion industries exploit this by declaring entire seasons obsolete, convincing you that clothing from merely months ago no longer functions aesthetically or socially. Streaming services keep you perpetually searching for the next show rather than allowing sustained engagement with what you are watching, because the neurochemical reward of discovery proved more addictive than the reward of deep expect. Consider the profound strangeness of boredom itself, that peculiar mental state where time seems to stretch and thicken, where nothing holds your attention despite the infinite possibilities available to you. You sit in a comfortable space, surrounded by entertainment, connection, and opportunity, yet you feel an aching emptiness, a restlessness that no distraction seems capable of filling. This is not the boredom of having nothing to do, but rather the deeper boredom that emerges even when everything is theoretically available to you. It is a symptom pointing toward something far more unsettling about the human condition itself. At its core, boredom reveals that we are creatures fundamentally driven by meaning-making rather than mere stimulus and satisfaction. When external activities fail to connect with something deeper within us, when they don't feed what we might call our search for purpose or significance, the mind rebels against them as empty calories. The uncomfortable truth is that boredom exposes the arbitrary nature of our pursuits and the fragility of the meaning we construct around them. It whispers to us that perhaps none of this truly matters, that our carefully structured lives and endless distractions are just elaborate ways of avoiding confrontation with the void of meaninglessness. We have normalized boredom as merely a signal to switch activities, to change our environment or scroll to the next piece of content, yet we rarely pause to consider what it actually represents. Boredom is your existential alarm system failing to trigger the kind of philosophical inquiry it should, because we have learned to silence it with immediate gratification rather than listening to what it might be telling us about the human predicament. Consider the strange paradox of human existence where we find ourselves perpetually dissatisfied with our circumstances, constantly yearning for something just beyond our reach, even when our immediate needs have been met and our basic survival is secured. We acquire the house we thought we wanted, and within months we feel the urge to renovate it, to move, or to accumulate more possessions within it. We achieve the career milestone that once seemed like the ultimate goal, and rather than experiencing lasting satisfaction, we immediately begin plotting the next advancement, the next achievement, the next rung on a ladder that appears to extend infinitely upward into an obscured sky. This restlessness operates on a physiological level where our brains are wired to seek novelty and stimulation, to scan constantly for threats and opportunities, to never quite settle into contentment, because such settling might have meant death in ancestral environments where complacency equaled vulnerability. The dopamine system that evolved to motivate us toward essential tasks now fires in response to notifications, achievements, and consumer goods, creating a neurochemical appetite that can never truly be satisfied because the reward mechanism resets after each acquisition. We have normalized this condition so thoroughly that we treat it as natural and inevitable, describing ourselves as ambitious or driven rather than acknowledging the underlying anxiety that propels us forward. The irony lies in recognizing that we have created entire civilizations, economies, and entertainment industries specifically designed to feed this restlessness, to offer temporary solutions that only deepen the cycle. We work harder to afford distractions from the work itself. We seek relationships hoping they will quiet the internal noise. We pursue spiritual practices in hopes of achieving peace. Yet the restlessness persists as a fundamental feature of consciousness. Consider the moment you finally achieve something you have wanted for months or years, that goal that consumed your thoughts and motivated your daily actions. And yet within days or weeks the sense of accomplishment dissolves into ordinariness, and your mind begins searching for the next mountain to climb, the next prize to pursue, the next version of contentment that always seems to exist just beyond your current grasp. This pattern repeats throughout your entire existence with such regularity that you might think you would recognize it and prepare yourself for it. Yet each time it arrives as something of a surprise, a small disappointment that settles into your consciousness like dust. The psychological mechanism at work here is known as hedonic adaptation, the human capacity to return to a baseline level of happiness regardless of positive or negative life events, meaning that the new car becomes simply transportation, the dream house becomes just where you live, and the achievement you once considered life-changing becomes merely something you did. Your brain, designed for survival rather than sustained satisfaction, constantly recalibrates what feels normal, shifting your reference point upward each time you gain something new, which ensures that satisfaction can never truly accumulate or compound into lasting contentment. What makes this particularly peculiar is that we understand this phenomenon intellectually. We have studied it and named it and written extensively about it, yet we continue to structure our entire lives around the pursuit of satisfactions we know on some level will not last, building elaborate plans and sacrificing present moments for future gratifications that will fade with predictable swiftness. We have normalized this cycle so thoroughly that questioning it seems almost radical, as though the endless pursuit itself has become the point rather than the destination, and perhaps that is precisely what has. Consider the person who has achieved what they believe to be their life's ambition, who has constructed a carefully curated existence built upon specific beliefs about how the world works and what they need to be happy, and who has arranged their daily routines, relationships, and goals around this comfortable framework of understanding. They wake each morning with a sense of purpose because they do not know what they do not know, and this absence of awareness allows them to feel satisfied with their trajectory and their choices. The moment this person encounters new information, a conflicting perspective, or an uncomfortable truth about reality, something shifts beneath the surface of their contentment, and they find themselves unable to return to their previous state of ease. This is because knowledge, once acquired, cannot be forgotten, and the expansion of one's understanding of the world necessarily contracts the space in which simple satisfaction can exist. The psychological mechanism at work here is straightforward but devastating. Contentment thrives in the soil of limited information, and ignorance functions as an essential nutrient for peace of mind. When we do not know the full extent of suffering in the world, we can enjoy our own comfort without the weight of that knowledge pressing against our conscience. When we do not understand the mechanics of our own self-deception, we can believe in our narratives about ourselves without contradiction. When we remain unaware of the fragility of our circumstances, we can rest in the assumption of stability. Yet we have built entire systems of society that encourage us to remain partially blind, not out of malice, but because the alternative would render normal functioning nearly impossible. We accept news headlines but do not research their depths. We acknowledge problems exist but do not contemplate solutions that would require personal sacrifice. Consider the person who wakes each morning with a sense of purpose and contentment, believing their work matters profoundly, their relationships are uniquely meaningful, and their life is progressing toward something significant. They move through their day with a lightness that seems almost enviable, unburdened by the weight of existential scrutiny. Yet if they were to examine their situation with complete honesty, they might recognize that their job is ultimately replaceable, their impact negligible in the grand scheme of human history, their relationships subject to the randomness of circumstance and biology, and their progress merely a personal narrative imposed upon meaningless events. The gap between their experience of contentment and what a fully conscious examination of their reality would reveal is precisely the space occupied by delusion. It is not a delusion of facts so much as a delusion of significance, a carefully maintained belief in the importance of things that are, in objective terms, relatively insignificant. The human brain appears neurologically designed to construct these protective illusions, to filter out the overwhelming data that suggests our concerns are minor and temporary, and to instead focus our attention on the small sphere of meaning we have constructed. Without this filtering mechanism, without this capacity to believe in narratives that do not withstand logical scrutiny, most people would find themselves paralyzed by the recognition of their cosmic irrelevance. The happiness of millions of people exists in direct proportion to their willingness to not examine their assumptions too closely, to accept the stories they have been told about why their lives matter, to participate in shared delusions about progress, love, success, and legacy. Consider the person who spends years fighting against circumstances they cannot change, who wages internal war against reality itself, believing that sufficient anger or resistance might somehow alter what has already occurred or what lies beyond their control. They exhaust themselves in this battle, their nervous system perpetually activated, their mind cycling through variations of the same unchangeable truth, hoping that this time their fury or grief or denial might produce a different outcome. This is the condition of those who have not yet learned that peace is not achieved through force or domination of external reality, but through a fundamental shift in how they relate to what is. The psychological mechanism is deceptively simple. The human mind generates suffering not merely from difficult circumstances, but from the resistance to those circumstances, from the insistence that things should be other than what they are. When you fight against gravity, you do not defeat gravity, you simply injure yourself. When you resist an unchangeable past, you do not alter the past, you only perpetuate present anguish. Peace emerges only when acceptance settles into the mind, when the exhausting rebellion against what is true subsides, and the individual finally stops demanding that reality justify itself to their preferences. Yet we have normalized the opposite tendency throughout our lives. We celebrate those who refuse to accept limitations, who fight against all odds, who never surrender to circumstance, and we rarely examine whether this relentless pushing produces the peace we actually seek. We treat acceptance as weakness or resignation, as though peace could only come from victory rather than from understanding. The disturbing truth is that you may spend your entire existence struggling against immutable aspects of your condition, believing that sufficient effort will overcome them, when the alternative path to serenity has always been. Consider the person who lies awake at night, mind racing with concerns about tomorrow's meeting, next month's bills, or a conversation that went wrong 3 years ago. They understand intellectually that worrying changes nothing, that the future remains uncertain regardless of how much mental energy they expend, yet they continue the exhausting cycle anyway, believing that their vigilance somehow prevents disaster or maintains control over circumstances that are fundamentally beyond their grasp. This is the paradox of resistance. The harder we grip, the more tense we become and the more elusive peace becomes. Serenity, that rare state of genuine calm and acceptance, arrives not through greater effort or determination, but through the counterintuitive act of letting go, of releasing our desperate need to orchestrate every outcome and guarantee every safety. The psychological mechanism underlying this truth is rooted in how our nervous system responds to perceived threats. When we resist what is happening, when we struggle against reality itself, we activate our sympathetic nervous system, flooding our body with cortisol and adrenaline, keeping us in a state of perpetual fight or flight. Only when we cease this resistance, when we acknowledge that some things lie beyond our control and accept their existence anyway, does our parasympathetic nervous system activate, allowing genuine relaxation to occur. Yet despite understanding this mechanism, despite having read countless books about acceptance and mindfulness, most people continue to resist, to clench, to demand that life conform to their preferences. We have somehow normalized this exhausting approach as virtuous, calling it responsibility or caution or prudence, when in truth it is simply suffering by another name, a self-inflicted prison we maintain through sheer force of will. Consider the person who has lived a comfortable life, sheltered from genuine hardship, surrounded by abundance and security from birth, and you will notice something peculiar about their understanding of the world. It remains largely theoretical, abstract, disconnected from the lived reality that shapes human existence. Meanwhile, the individual who has endured significant loss, navigated through periods of profound uncertainty, faced rejection, experienced failure, or survived genuine deprivation speaks with a different kind of authority about life, carrying within their words a texture and weight that cannot be manufactured through reading or intellectual study alone. This pattern repeats across cultures, across centuries, across every human domain from philosophy to art to leadership, suggesting something deeply embedded in how wisdom actually develops within the human mind. The mechanism appears to operate through the transformation that suffering catalyzes. When comfort is stripped away, when expectations are shattered, when the protective illusions we construct about how the world works are violently dismantled, the human consciousness is forced to recalibrate, to develop new frameworks for understanding reality, to integrate truths that remain invisible to those who have never needed them for survival. Pain becomes a teacher precisely because it demands attention in a way that abstract knowledge never can, because it forces integration of understanding at every level of being, not merely intellectual comprehension, but emotional and instinctual knowledge as well. Yet we have structured modern existence in such a way that we attempt to eliminate suffering wherever possible, to shield ourselves and our children from discomfort, to anesthetize pain through countless mechanisms, all while simultaneously lamenting that younger generations lack wisdom, depth, resilience, and understanding. Consider the athlete who must push their body beyond its current limits, feeling the burn of muscles being torn down so they can rebuild stronger. Or the student who sits alone in a quiet room wrestling with concepts that make their mind ache. Or the person who decides to finally have the difficult conversation they have been avoiding for years, their hands trembling as they speak words that terrify them. In each of these moments, there is no pleasure, only the sensation of being stretched, challenged, and fundamentally altered by the experience. Yet this is precisely where transformation occurs. The discomfort serves as the catalyst for neurological rewiring, for the development of new capabilities and perspectives that were previously unavailable to us. When we encounter resistance, whether it comes from external circumstances or from our own psychological resistance to change, we are actually standing at the threshold of development. The brain adapts most readily when it is placed in states of productive struggle, when it must reorganize itself to meet demands that exceed its current capacity. This is not metaphorical, it is biological. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to physically restructure itself in response to experience, accelerates during periods of discomfort and challenge. We have somehow come to expect that growth should feel good, that becoming better versions of ourselves should arrive as a reward rather than as a result of effort and suffering. Yet we rarely encounter anyone who genuinely transformed without simultaneously encountering significant friction in their own consciousness, resistance from their environments, or the raw sensation of being fundamentally inadequate to the task at hand. We have normalized the belief that comfort and growth can coexist, that we can expand without contraction, that we can become without first being broken down, and this contradiction sits at the heart of why so many people ray. Consider the fundamental paradox that defines existence itself. Nothing remains the same, yet we spend our entire lives constructing elaborate systems designed to preserve permanence, to maintain stability, to resist the very nature of reality that governs us all. Every moment that passes is irrevocably different from the one before it. Your cells are dying and being replaced. The seasons shift without permission. Relationships transform whether we consent or not. And yet we move through life as though we can somehow negotiate with time itself, as though enough effort or enough willpower might allow us to keep things exactly as they are. The harsh reality is that change is not something that happens to you occasionally or in dramatic moments. Change is the baseline condition of existence, the default setting of the universe, the only true constant that has ever existed or will ever exist. Your body will age regardless of what you do, your memories will fade and distort no matter how carefully you preserve them, the people you love will become different versions of themselves, your skills will deteriorate without practice, your beliefs will shift through exposure to new information, and your circumstances will transform through forces entirely beyond your control. Yet despite understanding this intellectually, we construct our entire psychological architecture around the fantasy of permanence, around the desperate hope that if we just work hard enough or plan carefully enough, we can somehow freeze moments in amber and keep them suspended forever. We cling to jobs that no longer serve us because the alternative is change. We remain in relationships long past their expiration because the dissolution represents change. We refuse to acknowledge aging and attempt to cosmetically resist it rather than accept it as the natural progression of transformation. We construct our entire lives around the assumption that stability exists, that we can build something solid and permanent that will endure, that the ground beneath us will remain firm and reliable, yet the fundamental truth is that nothing in existence maintains constancy for any meaningful duration. Consider the person who has worked at the same company for 20 years, who has built a pension plan and a mortgage, and a sense of professional identity around this singular institution, only to discover through a single corporate decision or market shift that their position was never as secure as it appeared, that the company can dissolve or restructure or simply no longer require their services in moments, rendering decades of accumulated stability irrelevant. The psychological mechanism that allows us to ignore this reality operates through selective attention and temporal discounting, wherein we convince ourselves that the present circumstances will persist indefinitely because we lack the cognitive resources to live in constant awareness of impermanence, and because admitting the fundamental instability of everything would paralyze us into inaction. We have normalized this illusion so thoroughly that we treat stability as though it were a real property of the world, rather than a temporary configuration that exists only in the space between recognizable disruptions. And we pass this delusion to our children as wisdom, teaching them to plan for futures that cannot be planned for, to invest in permanence that does not exist, to base their sense of security and worth on foundations that are continually shifting beneath their feet. The financial markets collapse, relationships dissolve, bodies betray us, careers vanish, technologies render expertise obsolete, political systems transform, and yet we continue to act as though the next moment will resemble the last one, as though we have discovered some genuine stability when in fact we. Consider the house you grew up in, the one that felt so solid and eternal during your childhood, so much a part of your identity that you believed it would outlast you. And yet today it is occupied by strangers, or perhaps it has been demolished entirely, reduced to dust and memory. Consider the relationships that once seemed absolutely certain, the people you promised to love forever, the friendships you thought would transcend any distance or disagreement, and notice how most of them have faded into silence, into the category of people you no longer speak to, perhaps no longer think of at all. Consider your own body, which feels permanent in this moment as you exist within it, and yet every cell is being replaced continuously, your skeleton is dissolving and rebuilding itself, your skin is shedding in invisible layers, and the physical form you inhabited 10 years ago no longer exists in any tangible way. The universe itself operates on this principle of impermanence. Stars burn out after billions of years, mountains erode into plains, continents shift across the surface of the planet, and the very matter that composes everything is in constant motion and transformation. Yet we spend our entire lives creating the illusion of permanence, building monuments and taking photographs and writing documents as if these actions can somehow arrest time, can somehow preserve a moment or a possession or a relationship in its current state indefinitely. We invest enormous emotional energy in the belief that if we just maintain something carefully enough, if we just love someone intensely enough, if we just build something solidly enough, then it will somehow escape the fundamental law of impermanence that governs all existence. We normalize this denial so completely that we rarely even notice we are doing it, treating permanence as a reasonable expectation rather than an impossibility, grieving losses as though they represent some violation of how. Consider the permanence you feel in your daily life, the way you move through routines as though they will simply continue indefinitely, the sense that the people you know will always be there, that your career will sustain itself, that the world as you understand it will persist in its current form. Yet every single thing you perceive, every relationship you cherish, every accomplishment you've worked toward, every institution that feels immovable, every species that walks the earth, every star that burns in the night sky operates on borrowed time within a finite existence. The universe itself expands toward its own eventual heat-death billions of years from now, and on smaller scales everything decays. Your body ages cell by cell. Your friendships fade through distance and circumstance. Your passions shift as you mature. The careers you build eventually conclude through retirement or redundancy. The buildings you pass daily will one day crumble into dust. The civilizations you read about in history books emerged and vanished completely. The mechanism underlying this pattern is entropy itself, the thermodynamic principle that all organized systems naturally tend toward disorder, that energy disperses, that nothing maintains its structure without constant effort against the inevitable tide of dissolution. Yet we persist in our denial of this fundamental law, constructing our lives as though exemptions exist, as though our specific relationships or achievements might somehow transcend the universal rule. We normalize this contradiction by avoiding it entirely, by maintaining the psychological fiction that endings belong only to other people, other projects, other eras, while we and the things we love operate outside time's jurisdiction. We build legacies hoping they will outlast us, knowing statistically they will not. We love people knowing we will lose them. We create meaning in the face of meaninglessness. Consider the pristine kitchen you clean on a Sunday afternoon, every surface gleaming, every item organized in its designated place, every corner touched by intention and effort. Within days, without any additional effort on your part, dust settles on the countertops, dishes accumulate in the sink, crumbs appear on the floor, and the organized chaos of living reasserts itself. You must expend energy to maintain order, yet disorder requires nothing but the simple passage of time. This fundamental principle extends far beyond domestic spaces into the very fabric of existence itself. The second law of thermodynamics states that entropy, a measure of disorder and randomness in a closed system, always increases over time. Energy dissipates, structures degrade, organized matter tends toward disorganization, and every action in the universe nudges things slightly closer toward maximum entropy. Your body experiences this relentlessly as cells age and die, as proteins misfold, as the organized biological machinery that sustains you gradually falls into disrepair. Relationships, once vibrant and carefully tended, naturally drift apart if left unattended. Civilizations rise through concentrated effort and coordinated human will, yet they inevitably crumble and fragment. The universe itself began in an extraordinarily ordered state following the Big Bang, and it has been expanding into greater disorder ever since, moving toward a state of maximum entropy from which nothing can return. What troubles us most profoundly about entropy is that it represents an asymmetry in time itself. You cannot unbreak an egg by watching the pieces reassemble. You cannot unburn wood by cooling the ashes. The arrow of time points only in one direction, toward greater disorder, and all our efforts to organize, preserve, and maintain are ultimately temporary rebellions against an inevitable tide. Everything you possess, every structure you build, every relationship you cultivate, and every achievement you accomplish exists on a predetermined trajectory toward deterioration and collapse. The moment you acquire something new, the process of degradation has already begun, operating with the inevitability of a physical law rather than a mere probability. Your body decays from the moment of birth, your possessions oxidize and corrode, your homes develop cracks and rot, your knowledge becomes obsolete, your skills atrophy without practice, and your social connections erode through the simple passage of time and the accumulation of minor misunderstandings. This is not metaphorical but literal, observable in every dimension of existence, governed by the second law of thermodynamics, which dictates that entropy, disorder, and decay increase universally and irreversibly. Yet despite understanding this fundamental principle intellectually, most humans organize their entire lives around the futile premise that permanence is achievable, that we can somehow arrest this universal constant through sufficient effort, maintenance, or acquisition of better versions of what we already possess. We paint our houses knowing they will peel. We maintain relationships knowing they will transform or end. We build careers knowing they will become irrelevant. We study subjects knowing they will be superseded. The psychological mechanism that allows us to function despite this knowledge appears to be a systematic denial or compartmentalization, where we acknowledge decay in abstract terms while refusing to fully integrate this understanding into our daily decision-making processes. We normalize this contradiction so thoroughly that questioning it feels almost absurd, as if pointing out that everything falls apart is somehow philosophically unsophisticated rather than perfectly, demonstrably accurate. Everything you have ever built, loved, achieved, or created exists in a state of inevitable dissolution. The house you spent decades paying for will eventually crumble into dust or be demolished by someone else's vision. The relationships you nurture with such care will either end through circumstance or death, and the memories you hold so dearly will fade and distort until they become barely recognizable shadows of what actually occurred. Your body, which feels so permanent and solid in this present moment, is already in the process of aging and deteriorating at the cellular level, and every single person you know will experience the same inexorable decline. The career you invested years building toward will become obsolete as industries shift and technologies advance, rendering your carefully accumulated expertise suddenly worthless. Even your identity, the very sense of self that feels so continuous and real, is constantly changing as your beliefs evolve, your personality shifts, and your priorities transform across the decades. The civilizations we have constructed with such ambition and pride will fall and crumble just as surely as every empire before them, their grand monuments eventually reduced to archaeological curiosities studied by future generations who will barely recognize their original purpose. This is not a pessimistic observation, but rather a mathematical certainty embedded into the fabric of existence itself. We somehow manage to live our entire lives knowing this fundamental truth with perfect clarity, yet we construct our plans, make our commitments, and build our identities as though permanence were possible. We have normalized this extraordinary cognitive dissonance so completely that it rarely surfaces into conscious awareness, allowing us to function day after day despite the certainty of loss that underlies every moment of our existence. Consider the parent who lies awake at night, consumed by anxiety over their adult child's life choices, or the person who experiences profound grief not only at the moment of loss, but for years afterward, unable to let go of someone who no longer exists in their life, or the individual who stays in a relationship far longer than they should because the thought of separation feels unbearable despite clear incompatibility. These are expressions of a fundamental human condition that Buddhism identified thousands of years ago, yet we continue to experience with the same intensity today. The more deeply we attach ourselves to people, outcomes, and circumstances, the more we guarantee our own suffering when those things inevitably change, leave us, or fail to meet our expectations. The mechanism is deceptively simple. When we attach to something, we create a dependency between our emotional well-being and the permanence of that thing, and since nothing in existence is permanent, we have essentially constructed a guarantee of future pain. We invest our sense of self-worth into another person's behavior, we tie our happiness to outcomes we cannot control, we build our identity around roles and relationships that are temporary by nature. The mind then becomes a prisoner to these attachments, constantly working to maintain them, to prevent their loss, to suffer when they slip away despite our desperate efforts. What makes this particularly striking is how little this understanding changes our behavior despite its logical clarity. We know intellectually that all things pass, that holding tightly only increases pain, that detachment brings peace, yet we continue to grip with ever-tightening fingers. We normalize this suffering, treating it as the natural price of love and connection, rather than recognizing it as a choice we make through the strength of our attachments. Consider the person who has learned, through repeated disappointment or trauma, to distance themselves emotionally from others as a protective mechanism, and notice how this defensive posture gradually transforms them into someone capable of profound indifference toward human suffering, even suffering of those they once cared deeply about. The mechanism is deceptively simple. When we repeatedly withdraw our emotional investment from situations or people to avoid pain, we create neural pathways that make disconnection the default response. And over time, the protective walls we build become so normalized that we forget they were constructed for self-preservation rather than truth. What begins as a reasonable boundary between ourselves and a harmful situation metastasizes into a general inability to feel connection with anything, because the brain, in its efficiency, learns that engagement equals vulnerability equals pain, and therefore categorizes all engagement as a threat worthy of avoidance. We see this pattern everywhere in modern life, in the parent who becomes so emotionally unavailable to protect themselves from their child's needs that they become a hollow presence in the home, in the professional who detaches from their work's human impact to manage stress and finds themselves incapable of caring about consequences, in the long-term relationship where both partners have built such extensive emotional distance that they coexist as strangers sharing the same address. The paradox is that this coldness, which was meant to be temporary and situational, becomes permanent and generalized, spreading like a frost across the entire landscape of one's capacity for warmth, compassion, and genuine connection. And we have so thoroughly normalized this transformation that we call it maturity, wisdom, or boundaries, never quite acknowledging that we have sacrificed something essential about our humanity in exchange for a kind of emotional salve. You wake with intentions of perfect equilibrium, imagining that somewhere between work and rest, ambition and contentment, solitude and connection, there exists a stable middle ground where all aspects of life can coexist in harmonious proportion. Yet every single day you discover that the moment you shift weight toward one side of the scale, the other becomes immediately heavier, more demanding, more impossible to ignore. When you pour yourself into your career, relationships deteriorate and your health begins to quietly erode. When you prioritize family, your professional opportunities slip away to someone hungrier, someone less divided. When you finally attempt to care for your physical body through exercise and nutrition, your mental health falters under the stress of reduced productivity. The balance you seek is not merely difficult to achieve, it is fundamentally impossible to maintain because life operates not as a static equilibrium, but as a constant series of competing gravitational forces pulling you in incompatible directions simultaneously. The psychological mechanism driving this false pursuit involves our deep need for control and the comforting illusion that perfect management of our finite resources can produce infinite results across all domains. We have been conditioned to believe that with sufficient effort, better scheduling, higher discipline, or more sophisticated productivity systems, we can somehow transcend the basic mathematics of existence itself. Yet this fantasy persists despite being repeatedly disproven in every human life that has ever existed. We continue to feel guilty about imbalance, treating it as a personal failure rather than an inevitable feature of having multiple wants and only one life to live. The cruelty lies not in the impossibility itself, but in the persistent shame we carry for being unable to accomplish what nobody can accomplish, and in our steadfast refusal to accept that choosing. Consider the fundamental paradox that defines human consciousness itself. We are simultaneously the observer and the observed, the thinker contemplating thought itself, creating an endless loop of self-reference that has no logical exit point. We spend our entire lives accumulating knowledge and experience, yet the more we learn, the more acutely aware we become of how little we actually understand about the nature of reality, existence, and our place within it. This expansion of awareness paired with expansion of ignorance creates a paradox that cannot be resolved through logic alone. We fear death intensely, organizing our entire lives around its avoidance, yet death is the only truly certain event in existence, making all of our avoidance strategies ultimately futile gestures against the inevitable. We seek freedom and autonomy, yet we are constrained by the laws of physics, the limitations of our biology, the expectations of society, and the choices made by others before we were even born. We value authenticity and genuineness, yet we cannot help but perform versions of ourselves depending on context, audience, and circumstance, making true authenticity perhaps impossible to achieve or even define. We desire happiness and contentment, yet the pursuit of these states often prevents us from attaining them, as the very act of chasing fulfillment creates distance from it. We are told that suffering builds character and teaches us lessons, yet excessive suffering often only produces trauma and despair. We acknowledge that time moves forward irreversibly, yet we spend considerable mental energy dwelling in the past and projecting into the future, never quite present in the only moment we actually inhabit. These paradoxes are not errors in thinking or failures of logic, but rather they appear to be woven into the fabric of existence itself. Consider the fundamental asymmetry that governs human understanding. A single question can persist for centuries, accumulating weight and significance, while the answers we produce often crumble under scrutiny or become obsolete within decades. When Socrates asked what justice truly is, he generated a question so durable that 2,000 years of philosophers still grapple with it, yet the answers provided by each generation seem to lose relevance almost as soon as they are articulated. This is not because we lack intelligence or effort, but because questions operate according to different rules than answers do. A question is inherently generative, capable of spawning infinite interpretations and applications, while an answer attempts to close what is fundamentally an open aperture in human consciousness. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon is that questions invite participation and reimagining, whereas answers demand acceptance and belief. When we receive an answer, we are asked to stop thinking, to settle into certainty, but questions by their nature resist settlement and keep the mind perpetually engaged. What makes this pattern truly disturbing is that we have built entire educational and professional systems around the assumption that answers are what matter most, yet we live in a world where the shelf life of answers continues to shrink while the relevance of questions only deepens. We spend our childhoods memorizing answers, our careers defending answers, our relationships negotiating answers, and yet the questions that haunt us remain untouched, unresolved, waiting patiently beyond every conclusion we reach. The reality we have normalized is that certainty is an illusion we pursue because the alternative, living perpetually in productive uncertainty, feels unbearable to our minds.